Welcome. If you found your way here, you're looking for something calm, something to ease your mind as the day winds down or the night stretches ahead. This is a place to rest, to let go, and to drift through the story of how humanity learned to fly. Over the next few hours, we'll travel together through the history of aviation, from the earliest dreams of flight to the modern age of composites and computers, from fragile wings of wood and cloth to spacecraft landing themselves after journeys to orbit. We'll move slowly, gently, through the decades, exploring the machines and the people who built them, the dreamers and engineers who refused to accept that the sky was beyond reach. This isn't a lecture. There are no tests, no need to remember dates or details. This is simply a journey, narrated in a calm voice, designed to help you relax, to accompany you as you fall asleep, or to provide a quiet backdrop as you unwind. If you find comfort in this kind of content, if long, gentle documentaries help you find peace at the end of a long day, please consider subscribing. A like helps others discover these videos, and your support makes it possible to create more of them. It means more than you might think. Thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to spend this time learning, relaxing, drifting through history. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let the story carry you. And now, let's begin. Let's travel back to a time before airports and jet engines, to fields of grass and fragile wings, to the very beginning of the age of flight. Chapter 1. Early Dreams and First Flight. Before airports and jet engines, there were fields of grass and fragile wings of wood and cloth. Tonight, we begin where humans first left the ground. For thousands of years, flight existed only in dreams and myths. Ancient civilizations told stories of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun on wings of feathers and wax. Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines in his notebooks, imagining contraptions that might carry a human into the sky. But for century after century, these remained fantasies. Birds soared effortlessly overhead while humanity remained earthbound, watching and wondering, bound by gravity to the surface of the earth. But by the late 19th century, something had changed. The Industrial Revolution had given humanity new materials, new engines, new possibilities. Scientists were beginning to understand the principles of aerodynamics. Engineers were building lighter, stronger structures. The ancient dream of flight was no longer just a fantasy. It was becoming an engineering problem, and engineering problems could be solved. In 1884, two French engineers named Charles Renard and Arthur Krebs achieved something that had never been done before. They flew an airship, a dirigible they called La France, in a controlled circular path over the French countryside. This was not simply drifting with the wind, as balloons had done for a century. This was navigation. They could steer. They could return to where they started. It was a glimpse of what was possible, a small but significant crack in the barrier that had always separated humanity from the heavens. For the first time, people could see that controlled flight might truly be within reach. As the century drew to a close, others were pushing the boundaries in different ways. In Germany, a man named Otto Lilienthal became obsessed with understanding how birds flew. He watched them carefully, studied the shape of their wings, the way they angled their bodies in the wind. He built gliders, delicate frames of willow wood covered in waxed cotton fabric, and carried them to hilltops near Berlin. Then he ran down the slope and launched himself into the air. Again and again, he flew. More than 2,000 flights, each one an experiment, each one a lesson. He learned how to shift his weight to turn, how to adjust his body to stay balanced in the wind. Photographers captured him suspended in midair, a human being gliding like a bird, and these images circulated around the world. He became famous, a symbol of humanity's progress toward flight. Lilienthal understood that before anyone could build a powered flying machine, they first had to understand how to control it in the air. Gliding was the classroom where these lessons could be learned. His work taught the world invaluable lessons about the nature of flight, about lift and drag, about stability and control. Tragically, in August of 1896, one of those flights ended in disaster. A sudden gust of wind caught his glider. He lost control and fell from a height of about 50 feet. His spine was broken. He died the next day. His last words, reportedly, were simple and poignant: sacrifices must be made. His death was a somber reminder of how dangerous this pursuit was. But his legacy lived on in the notebooks and photographs he left behind, and in the minds of those who would come after him. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in Dayton, Ohio, two brothers who owned a bicycle shop were paying very close attention. Wilbur and Orville Wright read everything they could about Lilienthal and others who had tried to fly. They read about the experiments with balloons and airships. They studied the failures and the near successes. And they began to believe that they could solve the problem that had eluded everyone else. The Wright brothers were meticulous thinkers. They were not wealthy. They had no formal training in engineering or science. But they were smart, patient, and willing to work through problems step by step. They began building gliders of their own, testing them in the steady winds that blew across the beaches of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They chose that remote location carefully. The wind was reliable, the sand was soft for landings, and there were few people around to witness their failures. Year after year, they returned to Kitty Hawk. They built glider after glider, each one an improvement on the last. They flew them, crashed them, studied what went wrong, and built again. They realized that the data everyone else was using about wing shapes was incorrect, so they built their own wind tunnel back in Dayton and tested hundreds of wing designs themselves. They were scientists and engineers, though they would never have called themselves that. But the Wright brothers wanted more than gliding. Gliding was a start, but it was not true flight. True flight required power. It required an engine. The problem was that no engine existed that was both light enough and powerful enough for their needs. The engines available at the time were far too heavy. So, with the help of their bicycle shop mechanic, Charlie Taylor, they built their own. It was an aluminum engine, simple in design, producing about 12 horsepower. It was just barely enough. They designed propellers, carefully calculating the pitch and shape, treating them not as simple paddles but as rotating wings. This level of detail, this refusal to accept existing solutions, was what set them apart. And then, on December 17, 1903, on a cold and windy morning on the dunes of Kitty Hawk, everything came together. The aircraft they called the Wright Flyer sat on a wooden launch rail, its fabric wings trembling in the wind. Orville climbed aboard and lay flat on the lower wing, gripping the controls. Wilbur stood beside the wing, ready to steady it as it started moving. The engines sputtered to life. The propellers began to spin. And then the Flyer rolled forward along the rail, picking up speed. It lifted into the air. Orville held it steady, just a few feet above the sand. It flew for 12 seconds, covering 120 feet before settling back to the ground. 120 feet. It was shorter than the wingspan of a modern airliner. It was a distance you could walk in a few seconds. But it was flight. True, powered, controlled flight. For the first time in history, a machine carrying a human being had lifted itself into the air by its own power, moved forward without losing speed, and landed at a point as high as it started. They flew 3 more times that day. The fourth flight, with Wilbur at the controls, covered over 800 feet and lasted nearly a minute. Then a gust of wind flipped the Flyer over and damaged it beyond repair. But it didn't matter. They had done it. The age of aviation had begun. What made their success possible was something the Wright brothers understood better than anyone else at the time: control. Other inventors had focused on building engines or shaping wings, but the Wrights realized that the real challenge was controlling the aircraft once it was in the air. They perfected what we now call 3-axis control. They could pitch the nose up or down. They could your left or right. And, most importantly, they could roll the wings to keep the aircraft level or to turn. This system, which they achieved through a combination of a movable rudder, an elevator in front, and wing warping to twist the wings, is still the foundation of how aircraft are controlled today, more than a century later. They were not the only ones racing toward this goal. In fact, they had a rival who seemed far more likely to succeed. Samuel Langley was a respected astronomer and scientist, the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. He had significant funding, including $50,000 from the U.S. War Department. He had assistants, resources, and credibility. His flying machine, which he called the aerodrome, was launched from a catapult mounted on a houseboat in the Potomac River. Just days before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk, Langley made his attempt. On December 8, 1903, with reporters watching and cameras ready, the aerodrome was launched. It rose for a moment, then immediately pitched forward and plunged into the icy water. The pilot barely escaped. The press mocked the failure. Langley's reputation was shattered. He never attempted flight again. Meanwhile, 2 bicycle mechanics with no formal training and almost no money had succeeded where the well-funded scientist had failed. It was one of history's great underdog stories. Strangely, though the world was slow to believe. The Wright brothers had achieved the impossible, but they had done it in a remote location with only a handful of witnesses. Skepticism lingered. Newspapers were reluctant to print the story. Some people dismissed it as a hoax. The Wrights flew again and again over the next few years, refining their designs, building better aircraft, but they struggled to convince the world of what they had done. They even had difficulty selling their invention to the United States military. The army was skeptical. They had seen Langley's very public failure, and they doubted that flight was practical or useful. The Wright brothers were secretive about their methods, refusing to demonstrate their aircraft publicly until they had a signed contract. This caution protected their ideas but also fueled doubt. Across the ocean in Europe, the situation was different. Europeans were hungry for proof that flight was possible, and they were willing to celebrate anyone who could demonstrate it. In 1906, a wealthy and charismatic Brazilian aviator named Alberto Santos Dumont flew publicly in Paris. His aircraft, the 14 bis, lifted off the ground under its own power in front of a large crowd. It flew for about 200 feet. Importantly, it did so without the launch rails that the Wright brothers had used in their early flights. The crowd was ecstatic. Santos Dumont was celebrated across Europe as the first man to fly. The debate over who truly deserves credit for the first flight has never entirely gone away. In much of Europe and South America, Santos Dumont is still regarded as a pioneer equal to, or even greater than, the Wrights. But history has largely settled on the Wright brothers as the first to achieve controlled, powered, sustained flight. What Santos Dumont did was prove to a skeptical public that flight was real. Back in America, the Wright brothers continued their work in relative obscurity for a few more years. But by 1908, they were finally ready to show the world what they could do. Wilbur traveled to France and began a series of public demonstrations. He flew in graceful circles, making tight turns, staying in the air for over an hour at a time. The crowds were astonished. European aviators, who had been struggling to fly at all, realized they were years behind. By 1909, Wilbur Wright was flying over New York Harbor, circling the Statue of Liberty as hundreds of thousands of people watched from below, from rooftops, from boats in the water. The impossible had become undeniable. Flight was no longer a curiosity or a stunt. It was real, and it was here to stay. In just a few short years, humanity had gone from dreamers studying birds to pilots commanding machines through the open sky. The door to a new era had been opened, and it would never close again. The age of aviation had begun, and the world would never be the same. Chapter 2: The birth of military and commercial aviation. As the world stepped into the 20th century, flying shifted from experiment to enterprise. Planes became tools of war, mail, and daring adventure. The Wright brothers had proven that flight was possible, but in those early years, it remained unclear what flying machines were actually good for. They were fragile, expensive, and dangerous. They could barely carry one person, let alone cargo. Many people saw them as little more than expensive toys, curiosities for wealthy enthusiasts and daredevils. But a few forward-thinking individuals began to see potential. They imagined a future where aircraft could serve practical purposes, where they might carry messages, transport goods, or even play a role in warfare. The United States Army was among the first to take an official interest. In 1909, after years of hesitation and skepticism, the Army finally purchased its first airplane from the Wright brothers. It cost $30,000, an enormous sum at the time. The contract stipulated that the aircraft had to be able to fly for at least 1 hour, carry 2 people, and reach a speed of 40 miles per hour. The Wrights delivered a machine that exceeded these requirements. The Army now had an airplane, though no one was quite sure what to do with it. That first military aircraft was fragile and temperamental. It required constant maintenance. It could only fly in calm weather. And it was dangerous. In fact, during the Army's acceptance trials, there was a crash that killed Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, making him the first person to die in a powered aircraft accident. Orville Wright, who was piloting, was seriously injured. Despite this tragedy, the Army pressed forward. They recognized, however dimly, that aviation might someday change the nature of warfare. But military adoption was slow. For years, there were only a handful of military pilots in the entire United States. Training was informal and haphazard. Early pilots often taught themselves, learning through trial and error, through crashes and near misses. There were no flight schools, no standardized curriculum, no textbooks. If you wanted to learn to fly, you found someone who already knew how, and you watched them. Then you climbed into a cockpit and hoped for the best. It was a dangerous way to learn, and many early aviators paid for their education with their lives. Meanwhile, others were exploring commercial possibilities. If an aircraft could carry a person, perhaps it could carry mail. The idea seemed logical enough. Mail was light, valuable, and time-sensitive. In 1911, a pilot named Earl Ovington carried a small bag of mail on a short flight in New York, delivering it faster than any train or truck could have. It was a publicity stunt more than anything else, but it planted a seed. It would take several more years before airmail became a regular service. In 1918, the United States Post Office launched the first scheduled airmail route, running between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and New York. The pilots flew in open cockpits, exposed to wind and weather, following roads and railways to navigate since there were no instruments to guide them. They flew during the day only, because flying at night was simply too dangerous. If the weather turned bad, they landed in a farmer's field and waited it out. It was grueling, dangerous work. Many airmail pilots died in crashes. But the mail got through, and it got through faster than ever before. These early advances, both military and commercial, were happening slowly, incrementally. And then the world went to war. In 1914, Europe exploded into conflict. World War I began as a war of trenches and artillery, a grinding, brutal stalemate. But in the skies above the battlefields, something new was happening. Both sides brought airplanes to the front, initially using them for reconnaissance. Pilots would fly over enemy lines, observing troop movements and artillery positions, then return to report what they had seen. It was dangerous work, but invaluable. For the first time in history, commanders could see beyond the horizon. It didn't take long for someone to realize that if your pilot could see the enemy's pilot could see you. And if you could stop their pilot from reporting back, you gained an advantage. At first, pilots carried pistols and rifles, taking shots at each other as they passed in the air. Then they started carrying bricks and grenades, dropping them on enemy aircraft. It was crude and inefficient, but it was the beginning of aerial combat. The next step was inevitable. Someone mounted a machine gun on an airplane. But this created a new problem. The machine gun needed to fire forward, in the direction the pilot was flying, so he could aim the entire aircraft at his target. But the propeller was in the way. If you fired a machine gun through the propeller arc, you would shoot off your own propeller blades. Some early solutions were clumsy. Pilots mounted guns on the upper wing, firing over the propeller. Others mounted them at an angle, firing to the side. But these arrangements were awkward and made aiming nearly impossible. Then, in 1915, the Germans introduced something revolutionary. A Dutch designer named Anthony Fokker developed an interrupter gear, a mechanical system that synchronized the machine gun with the propeller. The gun would fire only when there was no propeller blade in front of the barrel. It was elegant, simple, and deadly effective. The Fokker Eindecker, equipped with this synchronized machine gun, gave German pilots an enormous advantage. For a time, they ruled the skies. Allied pilots called it the Fokker Scourge. The war accelerated aircraft design at an astonishing pace. What had taken decades to develop in peacetime now evolved in months. Engineers experimented with new wing shapes, stronger engines, better materials. Countries poured resources into aviation, desperate for any edge over the enemy. Aircraft that were cutting edge one year were obsolete the next. Speed increased dramatically. Early warplanes struggled to reach 70 miles per hour. By 1918, the fastest fighters could exceed 120 miles per hour. They were more maneuverable, more reliable, and far more dangerous. Dogfights became a common feature of the war, with pilots twisting and diving through the sky, trying to get behind an enemy long enough to fire a burst from their guns. Despite all these advances, the aircraft themselves remained surprisingly fragile. Frames were often made of wood, usually spruce or ash, chosen for being light and strong. The wings and fuselage were covered in fabric, typically linen or cotton, which was then treated with dope, a kind of varnish that tightened and waterproofed the material. These planes were held together with wire, glue, and hope. A few well-placed bullets could tear them apart. Fire was a constant terror, because the fuel tanks were unprotected and the fabric was flammable. Many pilots chose to carry a pistol, not to shoot at the enemy, but to shoot themselves if their plane caught fire. Parachutes were not standard equipment. The High Command feared that if pilots had parachutes, they might abandon their expensive aircraft too easily. By the time the war ended in November 1918, aviation had been transformed. Tens of thousands of aircraft had been built. Thousands of pilots had been trained. The airplane had proven itself as a weapon, a scout, and a symbol of modernity. But when the guns fell silent, a new problem emerged. What do you do with all those planes and all those pilots? After World War I, surplus military planes flooded the civilian markets. Governments sold them off cheaply, eager to be rid of the expense. You could buy a warplane for a few $100s, sometimes less. Suddenly, aircraft were accessible to ordinary people, or at least to those with a sense of adventure and a disregard for personal safety. Many of those young pilots who had flown in the war came home to find that there were no jobs for them. The skills they had learned, the courage they had shown, had no place in peacetime society. But they still knew how to fly. And there were planes available. So they bought those surplus aircraft, patched them up, and took to the skies. They became known as barnstormers. The name came from the idea of storming through the countryside, stopping at farms and small towns. They would land in a pasture, and word would spread. A pilot had arrived. For a few dollars, you could go up for a ride. Many Americans had never seen an airplane up close, let alone flown in one. The barnstormers gave them that chance. But a simple ride wasn't always enough to draw a crowd. So the barnstormers performed stunts. They flew upside down. They did loops and rolls. They flew low over the ground, skimming just above the treetops. Some performed wing walking, climbing out onto the wing while the plane was in flight. Others would hang from the landing gear or transfer from one plane to another in midair. It was reckless, dangerous, and wildly popular. These barnstormers traveled across rural America throughout the 1920s, bringing aviation to towns that had no airports, no infrastructure, nothing but open fields. They were part entertainer, part daredevil, part entrepreneur. They lived hand to mouth, flying from town to town, always one crash away from the end. Many of them did crash, but they kept the dream of flight alive in the public imagination during a time when aviation's future was uncertain. While the barnstormers were thrilling crowds, others were trying to build something more stable, more organized. They were trying to turn aviation into a business. The idea of a passenger airline, a company that would fly people from one place to another on a regular schedule, had been around since before the war. In fact, the very first scheduled passenger airline began in Florida in 1914, just a few years after the Wright brothers' first flight. It was called the St. Petersburg-Tampa Airboat Line, and it flew passengers across Tampa Bay, a journey that took about 20 minutes by air compared to several hours by land or sea. The aircraft used was a small flying boat, able to land on water. It carried one passenger at a time. The fare was $5, a significant amount of money in those days. The service ran for only a few months before it shut down, a victim of the end of the tourist season and a lack of sustained interest. But it proved that the idea was possible. After the war, the idea began to gain traction again. In Europe, airlines began to form, flying routes between major cities. In the United States, progress was slower. The country was vast, and the infrastructure didn't exist. There were no airports, no navigation aids, no weather forecasting systems designed for aviation. Flying was still seen as dangerous and unreliable. But airmail was different. Airmail didn't complain about rough flights or bad weather. It didn't need comfortable seats or reassurance. The post office continued to expand its airmail routes throughout the 1920s, and in doing so, it built the infrastructure that would later support passenger flight. Airfields were constructed. Navigation beacons were installed. Weather reporting improved. Pilots gained experience flying regular routes in all conditions. The pilots who flew airmail were a tough, determined breed. They flew in open cockpits, in all weather, day and night. They navigated by following landmarks, railways, and rivers. When fog rolled in or night fell, they flew by instinct and courage. The fatality rate was shockingly high. In the early years, it was said that the average airmail pilot lasted about 4 years before dying in a crash. But the work went on, because the mail had to go through. Slowly, steadily, aviation was becoming part of the fabric of society. It was no longer just an experiment or a curiosity. It was a tool, a business, a profession. The barnstormers brought the thrill of flight to ordinary people. The airmail pilots proved that flying could be reliable and useful. The military continued to develop aircraft for reconnaissance and combat, refining the technology year by year. The world was beginning to realize that the airplane was not a passing fad. It was the future. And that future was arriving faster than anyone had imagined. Chapter 3: The Golden Age of Aviation. In the 1920s and 1930s, flight carried glamour and risk in equal measure. Record breakers crossed oceans guided by little more than courage and a compass. The First World War had ended, and the world was trying to find its footing again. The 1920s roared with energy, optimism, and a hunger for something new. Jazz filled the dance halls, automobiles crowded the streets, and the cinema flickered to life in darkened theaters. It was an age of speed, of progress, of breaking boundaries. And nowhere was this spirit more alive than in aviation. The barnstormers were still crisscrossing the countryside, thrilling small-town crowds with their stunts and joyrides. Airmail pilots were flying regular routes, their planes becoming a familiar sight in the skies above America's cities. But what captured the public's imagination more than anything else were the record breakers, the pilots who pushed further, flew faster, and dared to cross distances that seemed impossible. There were prizes offered for those brave enough to try. Newspapers and wealthy benefactors put up huge sums of money for the first person to fly non-stop between distant cities, or to cross an ocean, or to circle the globe. These were not just sporting challenges. They were tests of endurance, navigation, and engineering. And they were incredibly dangerous. Many pilots died trying. The greatest prize of all was the Ortig Prize, $25,000 for the first pilot to fly non-stop between New York and Paris. It had been offered since 1919, but no one had claimed it. The distance was over 3,600 miles, far beyond what most aircraft could manage. The flight would take more than 30 hours, and much of it would be over the open Atlantic Ocean, where there were no landmarks to navigate by and no place to land if something went wrong. Several teams attempted it. Some crashed on takeoff. Some turned back when their engines failed. Some were never seen again, disappearing somewhere over the gray, indifferent sea. And then, in May of 1927, a young airmail pilot named Charles Lindbergh decided to try. Lindbergh was 25 years old, tall and lanky, with a calm, focused demeanor that masked an extraordinary determination. He had been flying mail routes in the Midwest, navigating by dead reckoning through storms and fog, learning to trust his instruments and his instincts. He was not the most famous pilot of his time, nor the most experienced. But he believed he could do what others had failed to do. Most of the other teams attempting the transatlantic flight were using multi-engine aircraft with crews of 2 or 3 people. Lindbergh took a different approach. He wanted to fly alone. A crew meant more weight, and weight was the enemy. Every pound of extra weight meant less fuel, and fuel was everything. He also believed that flying solo would keep him more alert. There would be no one to rely on, no one to share the burden. It would be just him, the engine, and the sky. He found a small aviation company in San Diego willing to build him a custom plane. They called it the Spirit of St. Louis. It was a single-engine monoplane designed for one purpose: to fly as far as possible on a single tank of fuel. Almost everything was stripped away to save weight. There were no luxuries, no comforts. The cockpit was tiny, barely large enough for Lindbergh to sit. And most strikingly, the aircraft had no forward windshield. The fuel tank was mounted directly in front of the cockpit, blocking the view ahead. Lindbergh would have to navigate by looking out the side windows or using a periscope. It was an odd, almost awkward-looking aircraft, but it was perfectly suited to the task. On the morning of May 20, 1927, Lindbergh took off from Roosevelt Field on Long Island. The plane was so heavy with fuel that it barely cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway. He turned northeast, out over the Atlantic, and disappeared into the sky. For 33.5 hours, he flew alone. He had no radio, no autopilot, no one to talk to. He fought off sleep by opening the window and letting the cold air blast his face. He flew through fog and storms, navigating by compass and the stars when he could see them. He had no idea if he was on course. He had no way of knowing if the wind had pushed him off track, if he would miss Europe entirely and run out of fuel over the ocean. But as the sun rose on the second day, he saw fishing boats below. Then the coast of Ireland appeared on the horizon. He was on course. He followed the coastline to England, then crossed the English Channel to France. As night fell, he saw the lights of Paris glowing in the distance. He landed at Le Bourget field just after 10 o'clock in the evening on May 21st. A crowd of over 100,000 people had gathered, waiting for him. When he touched down, they rushed the plane, overwhelming the police, lifting Lindbergh onto their shoulders and cheering wildly. He had done it. He had flown non-stop from New York to Paris, alone, in a single-engine plane. It was one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of aviation. Lindbergh became an instant celebrity, perhaps the most famous man in the world. His quiet courage and humble demeanor only added to his appeal. He returned to the United States as a hero, greeted by parades and adulation. More importantly, his flight changed how people thought about aviation. It was no longer just a stunt or a curiosity. It was a serious form of transportation with real potential. Investment poured into aviation. Airlines expanded. Aircraft manufacturers ramped up production. Lindbergh's flight marked the beginning of aviation's transformation into a major industry. But Lindbergh was not the only one pushing boundaries during this golden age. Pilots around the world were setting records, exploring new routes, proving that aircraft could go anywhere. In 1928, a young woman named Amelia Earhart crossed the Atlantic. She was a passenger on that first flight, not the pilot, but it made her famous nonetheless. She was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic, and the public was fascinated. She had short hair, an easy smile, and a passion for flying that was undeniable. The press called her Lady Lindy, comparing her to Lindbergh, though she bristled at the nickname. She wanted to be known for her own achievements, not as someone's female counterpart. Over the next several years, Amelia Earhart became one of the most accomplished pilots in the world. She set altitude records, speed records, and distance records. In 1932, she flew solo across the Atlantic, proving that her earlier crossing had not been a fluke. She was a skilled, determined aviator, and she used her fame to advocate for women in aviation, encouraging other women to learn to fly and pursue careers in a field dominated by men. In 1937, Earhart set out on her most ambitious journey yet. She planned to fly around the world along the equator, a route of nearly 29,000 miles. She and her navigator, Fred Noonan, departed from Miami in June, flying east across South America, Africa, and Asia. By early July, they had covered more than 22,000 miles. Only a few legs of the journey remained. On July 2nd, they took off from Lae, New Guinea, heading for Howland Island, a tiny speck of land in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The island was less than 2 miles long, surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean. It was one of the most challenging navigation tasks imaginable. The U.S. Coast Guard had positioned a ship near the island to provide radio guidance, but communication was poor. Earhart's last confirmed radio message reported that they were running low on fuel and could not find the island. Then there was silence. Despite an extensive search by the Navy and Coast Guard, Covering over 250,000 square miles of ocean, no trace of Earhart, Noonan, or their aircraft was ever found. They simply vanished. Theories have abounded ever since. Some believe they crashed into the ocean and sank. Others think they may have landed on a remote island and survived for a time. But no conclusive evidence has ever emerged. Amelia Earhart's disappearance remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of aviation, a somber reminder of the risks that these pioneers faced. While individual pilots were capturing headlines with their daring flights, the aviation industry itself was quietly maturing. Airlines were expanding, and aircraft were becoming more reliable and more comfortable. But there was a problem. Most airlines were losing money. Passengers were few, tickets were expensive, and the aircraft was small and inefficient. Flying was still seen as dangerous and uncomfortable, something only the wealthy or the desperate would consider. What the industry needed was an aircraft that could change the economics of flight, something reliable, efficient, and large enough to carry enough passengers to turn a profit. In the early 1930s, Boeing took a shot at solving this problem. They introduced the Model 247, a sleek, modern aircraft with 2 engines, retractable landing gear, and an all-metal construction. It was fast, smooth, and could carry 10 passengers in relative comfort. For a brief moment, it seemed like the 247 might be the plane that would transform the industry. United Airlines ordered dozens of them and began flying them on routes across the country. But Boeing made a critical mistake. They prioritized United's order and refused to sell the 247 to other airlines until United's needs were met. This left competitors scrambling for alternatives. One of those competitors was TWA, Transcontinental, and Western Air. They turned to Douglas Aircraft and asked them to build something even better. Douglas delivered. In 1935, they unveiled the DC-3, and it was a revolution. The DC-3 was larger than the Boeing 247, carrying 21 passengers instead of 10. It was faster, more efficient, and more comfortable. It had a wider cabin, allowing passengers to sit side by side with an aisle down the middle. The seats were cushioned. There were overhead racks for luggage. Some versions even had sleeper berths for overnight flights. It was the first aircraft that made flying feel less like an adventure and more like a civilized way to travel. But what really set the DC-3 apart was economics. It was the first passenger aircraft that could turn a profit on ticket sales alone, without relying on airmail contracts to subsidize the route. Airlines could fill the seats, cover their costs, and still make money. This changed everything. The DC-3 became the workhorse of the aviation industry. Airlines around the world bought them. By the time production ended, more than 16,000 had been built, including military versions. It flew routes across the United States, across Europe, across Asia. It was reliable, rugged, and beloved by pilots. Even today, nearly a century later, a few DC-3s are still flying, a testament to the quality of the design. As aircraft became more capable, engineers looked for ways to make them fly higher and faster. But there was a problem. The higher you flew, the thinner the air became. At 10,000 feet, the altitude where early airliners typically cruised, passengers could breathe normally, though some felt a bit lightheaded. But above that, the lack of oxygen became a real issue. Passengers would become drowsy, disoriented, even unconscious. Flying higher was only possible if you could keep the air inside the cabin at a safe pressure. In the late 1930s, engineers developed pressurized cabins, sealed compartments where air pressure could be maintained at comfortable levels even as the aircraft climbed to higher altitudes. This allowed planes to fly above much of the turbulent weather, making flights smoother and faster. It was another step toward making air travel practical and pleasant. But even as aviation advanced, there were reminders that progress was not without cost. Airships, those enormous, graceful dirigibles filled with lighter-than-air gas, had been flying passengers across oceans since the 1920s. They were slower than airplanes, but they were luxurious, quiet, and could carry far more people. The German Zeppelin Company operated a fleet of them, including the Hindenburg, the largest airship ever built. It was over 800 feet long, longer than 3 Boeing 747s placed end to end. Inside, passengers enjoyed fine dining, spacious cabins, even a smoking room, though the ship was filled with flammable hydrogen gas. On May 6, 1937, the Hindenburg arrived in New Jersey after a transatlantic flight from Germany. It was preparing to land when something went wrong. Fire erupted at the tail, and within seconds, the entire airship was engulfed in flames. It collapsed to the ground, a writhing mass of burning metal and fabric. Incredibly, many passengers survived, jumping from the gondola as it neared the ground. But 36 people died, and the disaster was captured on film and broadcast around the world. The Hindenburg disaster effectively ended the era of passenger airships. People no longer trusted them. Airplanes, though still dangerous, seemed safer by comparison. The future belonged to heavier-than-air flight. By the end of the 1930s, aviation had come an astonishing distance in just a few decades. The world was smaller now. You could fly from New York to Los Angeles in less than a day. You could cross the Atlantic in a matter of hours. Records that had seemed impossible were being broken routinely. Aircraft were faster, more reliable, and more comfortable than ever before. But the world was changing in darker ways as well. Tensions were rising in Europe and Asia. Dictators were rearming. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. And soon, aviation would once again be called upon to serve the needs of war. The Golden Age was coming to an end, and a new, more terrible chapter was about to begin. Chapter 4: World War II and Rapid Innovation. The skies soon filled with aircraft shaped by urgency and conflict. Innovation moved at breathtaking speed, changing aviation forever. The 1930s had been a time of progress and optimism in aviation. Airlines were expanding, aircraft were becoming more comfortable and reliable, and the world seemed to be shrinking as flight connected distant continents. But that optimism was about to be shattered. By the late 1930s, Europe was sliding toward war once again. Germany, Italy, and Japan were rearming, pursuing aggressive expansion and threatening their neighbors. Britain and France watched with growing alarm. The United States tried to remain neutral, but it was clear that the world was heading toward another catastrophic conflict. When war finally came in September 1939, aviation was no longer a novelty or a supporting element. It was central to military strategy. The aircraft of World War II would be faster, more powerful, and more deadly than anything seen in the previous war. And they would be produced in quantities that would have been unimaginable just a decade earlier. Over the course of the war, from 1939 to 1945, the combatant nations produced more than 300,000 aircraft. 300,000. Factories worked around the clock, turning out bombers, fighters, transports, and reconnaissance planes at a staggering pace. Entire industries were converted to aircraft production. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, building wings and fuselages, riveting aluminum sheets, assembling engines. Aviation had become the backbone of modern warfare. The war began with Germany's invasion of Poland, a swift and brutal campaign that demonstrated the power of coordinated air and ground attacks. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Dive bombers screamed down on enemy positions, sowing terror and destruction, while fighters swept the skies clear of opposition. It was a new kind of warfare, and it was devastatingly effective. By the summer of 1940, most of Western Europe had fallen. France had surrendered. Britain stood alone, an island nation separated from the German army by only the narrow waters of the English Channel. Hitler planned an invasion, but first, he needed control of the air. The German Luftwaffe was ordered to destroy the Royal Air Force, to bomb British airfields, and to break the will of the British people. What followed was the Battle of Britain, one of the most critical air campaigns in history. The fate of the free world, in many ways, hung in the balance. The British had a secret weapon, though few outside the military knew it at the time. They had radar. This revolutionary technology used radio waves to detect aircraft at long distances, even when they were hidden by clouds or darkness. Radar stations along the British coast could see German formations assembling over France and track them as they crossed the Channel. This gave British fighters precious minutes to scramble, to climb to altitude, and to position themselves for an attack. The fighter that became the symbol of Britain's resistance was the Supermarine Spitfire. It was sleek, graceful, and deadly. With its elliptical wings and powerful Rolls-Royce engine, the Spitfire could climb quickly, turn tightly, and match the best fighters the Germans had. Pilots loved it. It was responsive, forgiving, and beautiful to fly. More importantly, it was effective. Throughout the summer and fall of 1940, the skies over southern England were filled with twisting, turning dogfights. German bombers came in waves, escorted by fighters, aiming to destroy airfields and aircraft factories. British pilots took off again and again, sometimes flying multiple sorties in a single day, their nerves frayed and their bodies exhausted. The odds were often against them. They were outnumbered, and losses were heavy. But they kept fighting. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, famously said of the fighter pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Those few held the line. By the end of October, it was clear that the Luftwaffe had failed. Germany called off the invasion. Britain had survived, and the course of the war had shifted. Radar had transformed air combat. It was no longer enough to have fast planes and skilled pilots. You needed information. You needed to know where the enemy was, how many there were, and what direction they were heading. Radar provided that information, and it changed the nature of warfare. As the war progressed, radar became more sophisticated, guiding night fighters to bombers in the dark, helping anti-aircraft gunners aim their weapons, and allowing ships to detect aircraft far over the horizon. As the war spread across the globe, the role of aircraft expanded. They were not just fighters and bombers. They were scouts, transports, ambulances, and supply lines. They flew over jungles, deserts, mountains, and oceans. And one of the most important roles they played was strategic bombing, the idea that you could strike deep into enemy territory, destroying factories, railways, and cities, crippling the enemy's ability to wage war. The United States, once it entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, committed heavily to strategic bombing. American doctrine emphasized daylight precision bombing, the belief that you could hit specific targets like factories and oil refineries with enough accuracy to cripple the enemy's war machine while minimizing civilian casualties. The British, by contrast, favored nighttime area bombing, saturating entire cities with explosives and incendiaries. The aircraft that became the symbol of American air power was the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber, built to fly deep into enemy territory and return home despite heavy opposition. The name Flying Fortress was no exaggeration. The B-17 carried heavy defensive armament, bristling with machine guns mounted in turrets along the fuselage, in the nose, in the tail, and on the sides. A fully crewed B-17 had 10 men aboard, and they could put up a wall of gunfire against attacking fighters. But even with all those guns, the B-17 was vulnerable. German fighters learned to attack head-on, where the bomber's defenses were weakest. Anti-aircraft fire, known as flak, filled the sky with exploding shells, shredding metal and flesh. Bomber crews faced some of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the military. Flying a full tour of duty, typically 25 missions, required not just skill but extraordinary luck. The bombers flew in tight formations, hundreds of aircraft at a time, their contrails streaking the sky. The roar of their engines could be heard for miles. Over the target, the sky would erupt in black clouds of flak, and fighters would dive through the formations, guns blazing. Bombers fell, trailing smoke and flame, their crews bailing out if they had time, plummeting if they did not. It was brutal, relentless, and it went on for years. Germany responded with its own innovations. As the war dragged on and the tide began to turn against them, German engineers pushed the boundaries of technology in desperate attempts to regain the advantage. One of the most remarkable aircraft to emerge from this effort was the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262 was a revelation. It was powered not by a traditional piston engine turning a propeller, but by jet engines that sucked in air, compressed it, mixed it with fuel, and ignited it, producing a powerful thrust. The result was an aircraft that could fly over 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. It was sleek, futuristic, and terrifying. When the Me-262 appeared in the skies over Germany in 1944, Allied pilots were stunned. Their Spitfires and Mustangs simply could not catch it. The Me-262 could dive through a bomber formation, fire its cannons, and zoom away before the escorts could react. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was nearly untouchable. But the Me-262 came too late to change the outcome of the war. Germany was running out of fuel, out of trained pilots, and out of time. Production was hampered by Allied bombing raids. Many Me-262s were destroyed on the ground before they ever flew. And Hitler himself interfered, insisting that the aircraft be modified as a bomber rather than used purely as a fighter, a decision that delayed its deployment and diluted its effectiveness. Still, the Me-262 proved that jet propulsion was the future. After the war, both the Americans and the Soviets would race to develop their own jet fighters, drawing on German research and, in some cases, German engineers. The age of the propeller-driven fighter was coming to an end. While fighters dueled in the skies over Europe, another kind of warfare was unfolding in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Here, the aircraft carrier became the dominant naval asset, more important than even the largest battleship. Carriers could project power across thousands of miles of ocean, launching strikes against enemy ships, islands, and coastal installations without ever coming within range of the enemy's guns. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a turning point. American dive bombers, launched from carriers, caught the Japanese fleet by surprise, sinking 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. It was a devastating blow from which Japan never fully recovered. From that point on, control of the air meant control of the sea, and control of the sea meant control of the Pacific. Carriers operated floating cities, with crews numbering in the thousands. Below deck, aircraft were stacked wingtip to wingtip, fuel lines ran like veins, and bombs and torpedoes were stored in magazines. It was a dangerous environment. A single spark, a single mistake, could turn a carrier into an inferno. But the rewards were worth the risk. A carrier task force could strike anywhere, and the enemy could never be sure where the next blow would fall. Back in the United States, the war effort demanded not just aircraft and pilots, but an enormous support infrastructure. Aircraft had to be ferried from factories to bases, sometimes across the country or even across oceans. Initially, this task fell to male pilots. But as more and more men were needed for combat, a new solution emerged. Women stepped forward. In the United States, they formed the Women Air Force Service Pilots, known as the WASP. These women were trained to fly military aircraft, and they took on the dangerous job of ferrying planes from factories to airfields, towing targets for gunnery practice, and testing repaired aircraft to make sure they were airworthy. They were not officially part of the military, and they received less pay and fewer benefits than their male counterparts. If they died in the line of duty, their families had to pay to have their bodies shipped home. But they flew with skill and courage, delivering more than 12,000 aircraft over the course of the war. The contributions of women like the WASP were often overlooked during the war and for decades afterward, but their service proved that women could fly just as capably as men, and they paved the way for future generations of female pilots. As the war entered its final years, American engineers developed an aircraft that represented the cutting edge of bomber technology, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was massive, far larger than the B-17, with a longer range and a heavier bomb load. It was pressurized, allowing the crew to fly at high altitudes in relative comfort, above much of the anti-aircraft fire. And it featured remote-controlled gun turrets, operated by gunners sitting inside the fuselage, aiming and firing through a sophisticated system of periscopes and computers. The B-29 was designed specifically for the war in the Pacific, where distances were vast and targets were far from friendly bases. It could fly from islands like Guam and Tinian, strike targets in Japan, and return, all without refueling. In the final months of the war, B-29s conducted massive firebombing raids on Japanese cities, dropping incendiary bombs that created firestorms, destroying vast areas and killing hundreds of thousands of people. And then, in August 1945, the B-29 played a role that would change the world forever. On August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay took off from Tinian and flew to the Japanese city of Hiroshima. In its bomb bay was a single weapon, a uranium-based atomic bomb codenamed Little Boy. At 8:15 in the morning, the bomb was released. It detonated 43 seconds later, at an altitude of about 2,000 feet above the city. The explosion was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A blinding flash of light, a shockwave that flattened buildings for miles, a fireball that reached temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, and a mushroom cloud that rose into the stratosphere. Tens of thousands of people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the days and weeks that followed from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. The city was obliterated. 3 days later, another B-29, Boxcar, dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The devastation was similar. Japan, already reeling from months of conventional bombing and a naval blockade, surrendered on August 15, 1945. World War II was over. The atomic bomb had been delivered by aircraft, a fact that underscored just how central aviation had become to modern warfare. In just 6 years, the war had driven innovation at a breathtaking pace. Aircraft were faster, flew higher, carried more, and were equipped with technologies that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Jet engines, radar, pressurized cabins, remote-controlled weapons, and atomic bombs, all of these emerged or matured during the war. But the cost had been staggering. Millions of people had died. Cities lay in ruins. And the world now lived under the shadow of nuclear weapons, a threat that would define the next half-century. As the soldiers and airmen returned home, as the factories retooled and the nations began to rebuild, aviation stood at a crossroads. The technology developed for war would now be turned toward peace. Jets would carry passengers. Radar would guide civilian flights. The long-range bombers would inspire the next generation of airliners. The war had pushed aviation forward at a pace no one could have imagined. And now, as the world tried to heal, the question was, where would flight take us next? Chapter 5. The jet age begins. Then came the roar of turbines. The jet engine transformed travel and quietly shrank the planet beneath us. When World War II ended in 1945, the world was exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Economies were shattered. Millions had died. But amid the destruction, there was also transformation. The war had accelerated technology at an unprecedented rate, and nowhere was this more evident than in aviation. The jet engine, which had appeared in the final years of the conflict, was no longer a curiosity or an experimental oddity. It was the future. The principle behind the jet engine was elegant. Instead of using a piston engine to turn a propeller, pushing air backward to create thrust, a jet engine compressed incoming air, mixed it with fuel, ignited it, and expelled the resulting hot gases at tremendous speed. The reaction pushed the aircraft forward. It was simpler in concept than a piston engine, with fewer moving parts, and it could produce far more power for its weight. During the war, the Germans had proven that jets could fly faster than anything propeller-driven. The Messerschmitt Me 262 had shown what was possible. Now, in peacetime, engineers in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union were racing to refine the technology and put it to use. But before jets could carry passengers across oceans, there was another barrier to break, one that had seemed almost mythical. It was called the sound barrier. As aircraft approached the speed of sound, roughly 760 miles per hour at sea level, strange things began to happen. The controls became sluggish or unresponsive. The aircraft would shake violently. Shockwaves formed around the wings and fuselage, disrupting the airflow. Some pilots who had pushed their aircraft too fast in dives during the war had lost control and crashed. There was speculation, even among serious engineers, that the sound barrier might be an absolute limit, that no aircraft could ever fly faster than sound and survive. The United States military wanted to know if it was possible. They commissioned a small, rocket-powered aircraft called the Bell X-1. It was painted bright orange, shaped like a bullet with stubby wings, and it was designed for one purpose: to go faster than sound. On October 14, 1947, a test pilot named Chuck Yeager climbed into the cramped cockpit of the X-1. He was 24 years old, a former fighter pilot with a reputation for skill and nerves of steel. 2 nights earlier, he had broken 2 ribs in a horseback riding accident, but he told no one. He knew that if the doctors found out, he would be grounded, and someone else would get the flight. The X-1 was carried aloft beneath the belly of a B-29 bomber. At 20,000 feet, the bomber released it. Yeager ignited the rocket engine, and the X-1 shot forward like a missile. The speed built rapidly. The aircraft began to buffet and shake. And then, suddenly, the shaking stopped. The ride smoothed out. The instruments showed that he was flying faster than the speed of sound. He had broken the barrier. There was no explosion, no catastrophic failure. The sound barrier was not a wall. It was a threshold, and Yeager had crossed it. The sonic boom, a thunderous crack caused by the shockwaves trailing behind the aircraft, echoed across the desert below. It was a new sound, the sound of the future. Yeager's achievement proved that supersonic flight was possible, and it opened the door to a new generation of high-speed aircraft. Military jets began pushing faster and faster. Fighters that could exceed the speed of sound became standard. The age of the supersonic jet had arrived. But while test pilots were breaking records in the skies above the desert, commercial aviation was still relying on propeller-driven aircraft. The Douglas DC-6 and the Lockheed Constellation were the workhorses of the airlines, graceful, reliable planes with 4 powerful piston engines. They could carry dozens of passengers across continents and oceans, but they were slow. A flight from New York to London took over 12 hours, often longer if headwinds were strong. Passengers endured long, droning journeys, the vibration of the engines a constant companion. The airlines knew that jets could change everything. They could fly faster, higher, and more smoothly. But building a jet airliner was a massive undertaking, expensive and risky. Whoever did it first would either revolutionize the industry or go bankrupt trying. The British decided to take the leap. De Havilland, a respected aircraft manufacturer, began developing a jet-powered airliner in the late 1940s. They called it the Comet. It was sleek and beautiful, with 4 jet engines buried in the wings, a pressurized cabin, and large square windows that gave passengers a panoramic view. It promised to cut travel times in half. In 1952, the de Havilland Comet entered service with British Overseas Airways Corporation. It was the world's first commercial jet airliner, and it was a sensation. Passengers marveled at the smooth, quiet ride, so different from the rattle and roar of propeller planes. The Comet could cruise at over 500 miles per hour, far faster than anything else in the sky. It seemed like the future had arrived. For a while, everything seemed perfect. The Comet flew routes across Europe, to Africa, to Asia. Other airlines placed orders. Britain had taken the lead in the jet age, and the rest of the world was scrambling to catch up. And then disaster struck. In January 1954, a comet broke apart in mid-air over the Mediterranean, killing everyone on board. Investigators searched for the wreckage, but it had sunk deep into the sea. The cause was unclear. It might have been a bomb, sabotage, or a mechanical failure. The comet fleet was grounded briefly, inspected, and then returned to service. A few months later, it happened again. Another comet disintegrated in flight, this time over the Mediterranean near Italy. Again, there were no survivors. The fleet was grounded indefinitely. The British government launched an exhaustive investigation. They recovered pieces of the wreckage from the seafloor, painstakingly reconstructing the aircraft like a jigsaw puzzle. They built a water tank and placed a complete comet fuselage inside, then subjected it to thousands of cycles of pressurization and depressurization, simulating years of flight in a matter of weeks. Eventually, the fuselage failed. A crack appeared at the corner of one of the square windows and rapidly spread, tearing the structure apart. The investigators had found the problem. It was metal fatigue, a phenomenon not fully understood at the time. Every time the aircraft climbed to altitude, the cabin was pressurized, stretching the metal. Every time it landed, the pressure was released and the metal relaxed. Over time, this cycle caused microscopic cracks to form, especially at sharp corners like the window frames. Eventually, those cracks grew large enough to cause catastrophic failure. The comet's square windows, which had seemed so modern and appealing, were a fatal flaw. The sharp corners concentrated stress in the metal. Rounded windows would have distributed the stress more evenly. It was a painful lesson, learned at the cost of lives. De Havilland redesigned the Comet, but the damage to its reputation was done. Orders were cancelled. Airlines lost confidence. The Comet would never dominate the skies as its designers had hoped. But the tragedy was not in vain. The investigation into the comet crashes advanced the understanding of metal fatigue and aircraft design more than perhaps any other single event. The lessons learned would make every airliner that followed safer. Windows became rounded. Structures were reinforced. Testing became more rigorous. The Comet had failed, but it had taught the world how to build better aircraft. While the British were grappling with the Comet's problems, American manufacturers were watching and learning. Boeing, a company with a long history of building military bombers, decided to take a gamble. They would build their own jet airliner, incorporating everything they had learned from the Comet disaster and from their own experience with military jets. The result was the Boeing 707. It first flew in 1957 and entered commercial service in 1958 with Pan American World Airways. The 707 was larger than the Comet, with 4 powerful turbojet engines mounted on pylons beneath swept wings. Those swept wings were critical. Engineers had discovered during the war that sweeping the wings backward improved performance at high speeds, delaying the onset of shockwaves and allowing the aircraft to fly closer to the speed of sound without the violent buffeting that plagued straight-wing designs. The 707 could carry over 140 passengers, far more than the Comet. It had a range of over 3,000 miles, enough to cross the Atlantic non-stop. And it was reliable. Boeing had learned from the comet's mistakes. The windows were rounded. The fuselage was carefully designed to handle the stresses of pressurization. And it worked. The 707 launched the modern era of jet travel. It was an immediate success. Airlines around the world rushed to buy them. Pan Am used them to open new routes, shrinking travel times and making international travel accessible to more people than ever before. A flight from New York to London, which had taken 12 hours or more in a piston-engine airliner, now took just over 7 hours. The Pacific could be crossed in a matter of hours instead of days. The world was becoming smaller. Other manufacturers quickly followed. Douglas introduced the DC-8, a direct competitor to the 707. Convair built the 880 and 990, smaller and faster jets aimed at a different market. The skies filled with the roar of turbines, the white contrails of jets streaking across the blue. Jet engines drastically reduced travel times, but they also changed the experience of flight in other ways. Jets could cruise comfortably above 30,000 feet, well above most weather. Passengers no longer had to endure the stomach-churning turbulence of thunderstorms or the buffeting of strong winds at lower altitudes. The ride was smooth, almost serene. You could look out the window and see the curve of the Earth, the thin blue line of the atmosphere against the black of space. The jet age also changed the economics of air travel. Jets were faster, which meant they could complete more flights in a day, generating more revenue. They were more efficient at high altitudes, burning less fuel per mile than piston engines. And as production ramped up and competition increased, ticket prices began to drop. Flying was no longer just for the wealthy. It was becoming accessible to the middle class, to families, to ordinary people who wanted to see the world. But while commercial aviation was entering the jet age, military aviation was pushing even further. The Korean War, which began in 1950, saw the first large-scale jet versus jet combat in history. American pilots flying F-86 Sabres faced off against Soviet-built MiG-15s flown by North Korean, Chinese, and, secretly, Soviet pilots. The dogfights over the Yalu River were fierce and fast, with both sides pushing their aircraft to the limit. The Sabre and the MiG-15 were evenly matched in many ways. The MiG could climb faster and had a slight edge at high altitudes. The Sabre was more stable and easier to control, especially at high speeds. Pilot skill often made the difference. American pilots, many of them veterans of World War II, had more experience. But the communist pilots were learning quickly, and the battles were brutal. The Korean War confirmed what many had suspected: the future of air combat belonged to jets. Propeller-driven fighters were obsolete. Speed, altitude, and maneuverability were paramount, and jets delivered all three. As the 1950s progressed, jets became faster and more capable. Fighters began routinely flying at twice the speed of sound. Bombers were designed to carry nuclear weapons across continents, flying at altitudes so high that they were nearly untouchable. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was largely a technological race. and aviation was at the forefront. But it was not just about military power. The jet engine was transforming civilian life as well. Business executives could fly across the country for meetings and return home the same day. Families could vacation on distant continents. Immigrants could stay connected with their homelands. The world was no longer divided by vast, unbridgeable distances. You could stand in New York in the morning and walk the streets of Paris by evening. The jet age shrank the world dramatically. There was a sense, in those years, that anything was possible. Humanity had conquered the skies. We had broken the sound barrier. We had built machines that could fly faster than a rifle bullet, higher than the eagles. And we were just getting started. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, engineers and dreamers began to look even higher. Jets had mastered the atmosphere, but beyond the thin blue shell of air surrounding the Earth lay something even more challenging, even more alluring. Space. The final frontier. And the same technology that powered jet engines, the same principles of thrust and aerodynamics, would carry humanity beyond the atmosphere and into the void. The jet age had begun with a roar, and it showed no signs of slowing down. The future stretched out ahead, vast and full of promise. And somewhere, in research labs and wind tunnels, the next great leap was already being planned. Chapter 6. The Space Race and Supersonic Dreams. As jets conquered the atmosphere, rockets aimed higher. Nations turned their gaze from clouds to the stars. By the late 1950s, jet aircraft had become commonplace. They carried passengers across oceans, patrolled the skies in defense of nations, and set new records almost monthly. The atmosphere had been tamed. But there was a limit to what jets could do. They needed air to breathe, air for their engines to compress and burn. Above a certain altitude, the air became too thin, and jets could climb no higher. But rockets were different. Rockets carried their own oxygen, their own fuel. They didn't need the atmosphere. They could go higher, faster, beyond the blue sky and into the black void of space. And in the 1950s, as the Cold War deepened and tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grew more intense, both nations began to see space not just as a scientific frontier, but as a strategic battleground. The competition began quietly, with captured German technology. At the end of World War II, both the Americans and the Soviets had raced to seize German rocket scientists and their research. The V-2 rocket, developed by Wernher von Braun and his team, had been the world's first long-range ballistic missile, capable of reaching the edge of space before plummeting back to Earth. It had terrorized London in the final years of the war, but it had also proven that spaceflight was possible. Von Braun and many of his colleagues ended up in the United States, where they continued their work. Other German scientists were taken to the Soviet Union, where they shared their knowledge with Soviet engineers. Both sides began building bigger, more powerful rockets, ostensibly for military purposes, but with an eye towards something more ambitious. On October 4, 1957, the world woke to shocking news. The Soviet Union had launched an artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. They called it Sputnik 1, a small, polished sphere about the size of a beach ball, equipped with radio transmitters that sent out a steady beeping signal. That signal could be picked up by radio operators around the world, a constant reminder that the Soviets had achieved something extraordinary. Sputnik 1 was a triumph of engineering and a propaganda victory. It proved that the Soviet Union was capable of putting objects into space, and by extension, it proved that they could launch intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads to American cities. The beeping of that little satellite sent shockwaves through the United States. The American public was stunned. Politicians demanded answers. How had the Soviets beaten us into space? What did this mean for national security? The media called it the Sputnik crisis, and it sparked a wave of soul-searching and urgency. In response, the United States government poured resources into its own space program. In 1958, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was founded, bringing together various government research efforts under a single civilian agency. The goal was clear: catch up to the Soviets and then surpass them. But the Soviets were not standing still. In April 1961, they achieved another historic milestone. A young Soviet Air Force pilot named Yuri Gagarin climbed aboard a spacecraft called Vostok 1, perched atop a massive rocket, and was launched into space. He orbited the Earth once, completing a full circuit of the planet in just under 2 hours, before re-entering the atmosphere and parachuting safely to the ground. Gagarin became an instant hero, celebrated across the Soviet Union and recognized around the world. He was the first human being to leave the Earth, to see the planet from space, to experience weightlessness. His famous words, transmitted from orbit, were simple and profound: "The Earth is blue. How wonderful! It is amazing." Once again, the United States had been beaten. American astronauts had flown suborbital flights, brief arcs into space and back, but they had not yet orbited. The Soviets seemed to be winning the space race at every turn. President John F. Kennedy, newly elected and determined to restore American prestige, made a bold decision. In May 1961, less than a month after Gagarin's flight, Kennedy stood before Congress and made a declaration that would define the next decade. He said that the United States should commit itself to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It was an audacious goal. At the time, American astronauts had barely reached space. The technology to travel to the moon, land on its surface, and return did not exist. No one knew if it was even possible. But Kennedy believed that such a challenge would galvanize the nation, focus its resources, and demonstrate American technological superiority. Thus began the Apollo program, one of the most ambitious undertakings in human history. Thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians worked on the project. Entire new facilities were built. Billions of dollars were spent. The goal was singular and clear: reach the moon. The challenges were immense. Rockets had to be built that were powerful enough to escape Earth's gravity and send a spacecraft all the way to the Moon, 250,000 miles away. Navigation had to be precise, because there were no landmarks in space, no roads to follow. Life support systems had to keep astronauts alive for days in the vacuum of space. And a lunar lander had to be designed that could descend to the Moon's surface, land safely, and then take off again to rendezvous with the command module orbiting above. The rocket that would make it all possible was called the Saturn V. It remains, to this day, one of the most powerful rockets ever built. It stood over 360 feet tall, taller than a 30-story building. It weighed 6 million pounds when fully fueled. And when it launched, it produced over 7.5 million pounds of thrust, enough to shake the ground for miles around. The first stage of the Saturn V burned for just over 2.5 minutes, lifting the rocket out of the atmosphere. Then it separated and fell away, and the second stage ignited, pushing the spacecraft even higher and faster. Finally, the third stage fired, accelerating the spacecraft to over 25,000 miles per hour, the speed needed to escape Earth's gravity and coast toward the Moon. The Apollo program proceeded through a series of test flights, each one more ambitious than the last. There were setbacks and tragedies. In January 1967, a fire broke out during a ground test of Apollo 1, killing 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The program was grounded for months while engineers redesigned the spacecraft, making it safer. But the work continued. By 1968, Apollo 8 carried astronauts around the Moon and back, the first humans to leave Earth orbit and see the far side of the Moon with their own eyes. They broadcast a Christmas Eve message from lunar orbit, reading from the book of Genesis as the Earth rose above the Moon's horizon, a fragile blue and white marble against the blackness of space. And then, in July 1969, Apollo 11 set out to achieve what Kennedy had promised. The crew consisted of 3 men: Neil Armstrong, the mission commander, a calm and experienced test pilot; Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, sharp and analytical; and Michael Collins, the command module pilot, who would remain in orbit while his crewmates descended to the surface. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, which they had named Eagle, and separated from the command module. Collins stayed behind, alone, circling the Moon every 2 hours, waiting and watching. The descent to the surface was tense. The lunar module's computer was guiding them toward a landing site, but as they drew closer, Armstrong saw that it was strewn with boulders, too dangerous to land. He took manual control, flying the module horizontally, searching for a smooth spot. Fuel was running low. Mission Control watched the telemetry, their voices calm but urgent. 60 seconds of fuel remaining. 30 seconds. And then, with just seconds to spare, the Eagle touched down on the Moon's surface, in a region called the Sea of Tranquility. Armstrong's voice crackled over the radio, understated and steady, "The Eagle has landed." Hours later, after checking systems and preparing their equipment, Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder. At the bottom, he paused, then stepped off onto the lunar surface. It was July 20th, 1969. His words, transmitted across 240,000 miles of space, were heard by millions around the world. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Aldrin joined him, and together they spent over 2 hours on the moon's surface. They planted an American flag, collected rock samples, set up scientific instruments, and took photographs. They moved in slow, bounding hops, their movements graceful in the low gravity. The landscape was stark and alien, gray dust and ancient stone beneath a black sky, the Earth hanging above them like a jewel. When they returned to the lunar module and blasted off to rejoin Collins, they left behind a plaque attached to one of the landing legs. It read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." Armstrong's landing on the moon in 1969 was the culmination of a decade of effort, a triumph of human ingenuity and determination. It was also, in many ways, the peak of the space race. The United States had achieved what the Soviet Union had not. The race, at least in the public imagination, had been won. But even as humanity was reaching for the stars, engineers on Earth were pushing the boundaries of atmospheric flight in new and extraordinary ways. If rockets represented one extreme, going higher and faster than any jet could manage, then supersonic passenger aircraft represented another, bringing the speed and thrill of military jets to ordinary travelers. The dream of supersonic passenger flight had been around since the early days of the jet age. If fighter jets could fly faster than sound, why couldn't airliners? The challenge was making it safe, comfortable, and economically viable. Two nations took up the challenge seriously, Britain and France, working together, and the Soviet Union. The result of the British-French collaboration was the Concorde, one of the most beautiful and ambitious aircraft ever built. The Concorde first flew in 1969, the same year that Armstrong walked on the moon. It was sleek and graceful, with a long, slender fuselage and a delta wing that swept back sharply from the nose. It had 4 powerful turbojet engines that could push it to speeds of over twice the speed of sound, Mach 2, or about 1,300 miles per hour. Flying on the Concorde was unlike anything else. The aircraft climbed steeply after takeoff, the engines roaring with power. As it accelerated through the speed of sound, passengers felt a slight bump, the transition from subsonic to supersonic flight. Then the ride smoothed out, and the Concorde settled into a cruise at 60,000 feet, twice as high as conventional airliners. At that altitude, the sky outside the windows was a deep, dark blue, almost purple. You could see the curvature of the Earth. The Concorde could cross the Atlantic in just over 3 hours, less than half the time of a conventional jet. You could leave London after breakfast and arrive in New York before lunch, thanks to the time zone difference. It was a marvel of engineering, a symbol of speed and luxury. But it had drawbacks. The Concorde was loud, especially on takeoff, its sonic boom a thunderous crack that could rattle windows and disturb communities below. For this reason, It was not allowed to fly at supersonic speeds over land, limiting its routes primarily to transatlantic crossings. It was also expensive to operate, burning fuel at a prodigious rate. Tickets were costly, accessible only to the wealthy and to business travelers on expense accounts. Still, for those who could afford it, the Concorde was an unforgettable experience. It flew commercially for over 27 years, from 1976 until 2003, when it was finally retired. No supersonic passenger aircraft has entered service since. While the Concorde was designed for passengers, the United States was developing a supersonic aircraft for an entirely different purpose: reconnaissance. The State Route 71 Blackbird was built to fly higher and faster than any interceptor or surface-to-air missile could reach, photographing enemy territory and gathering intelligence without ever being touched. The State Route 71 was a masterpiece of engineering. It was built almost entirely of titanium, a metal that could withstand the extreme heat generated by flying at over 3 times the speed of sound. At Mach 3, air friction heated the aircraft's skin to over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft actually expanded several inches in length during flight as the metal heated up. Fuel leaked from the tanks on the ground because the panels didn't seal properly until they heated up and expanded in flight. The Blackbird could exceed Mach 3, cruising at over 2,000 miles per hour, and it could fly at altitudes above 85,000 feet, at the very edge of space. At that height, the pilots wore pressure suits similar to those worn by astronauts, because the air was too thin to breathe and the cabin pressure alone was not enough to keep them alive. The State Route 71 was nearly invulnerable. If a surface-to-air missile was launched at it, the standard procedure was simply to accelerate. The Blackbird could outrun almost anything. Over its decades of service, no State Route 71 was ever shot down, though many missiles were fired at them. It flew reconnaissance missions over hostile territory, photographing military installations, tracking troop movements, and gathering signals intelligence. The cameras aboard the Blackbird were so powerful that they could photograph a license plate from 16 miles up. The aircraft would streak across the sky, a black dart trailing twin plumes of fire, gone before anyone on the ground even realized it had been there. The State Route 71 was retired in the late 1990s, replaced by satellites and unmanned drones. But it remains, even today, one of the fastest manned aircraft ever built. Its records still stand. The 1960s had been a decade of astonishing achievement. Humanity had broken free of the Earth and walked on the Moon. We had built aircraft that could fly at 3 times the speed of sound and passenger planes that could cross the Atlantic faster than the sun appeared to move across the sky. The boundaries of what was possible had been redrawn again and again. But as the decade came to a close, the pace of innovation began to slow. The moon landings continued for a few more years, but public interest waned. The cost of the Apollo program was enormous, and there were growing questions about whether the money might be better spent on problems here on Earth. The last Apollo mission to the Moon flew in 1972. Humanity has not returned since. The Concorde flew on, a symbol of a particular kind of optimism, but it never became the future of air travel that its designers had imagined. Supersonic flight remained a niche, limited by noise, cost, and fuel consumption. The State Route 71, for all its elegance and power, was eventually made obsolete by technology that didn't require a human pilot at all. The space race and the era of supersonic dreams had been driven by competition, by the Cold War rivalry between superpowers, by the desire to prove technological superiority. But as the world moved into the 1970s and beyond, those motivations began to fade. Détente replaced confrontation, at least for a time. Budgets tightened. Priorities shifted. Yet the achievements of that era remain. The footprints on the moon are still there, untouched in the airless silence. The records set by the Blackbird still stand. And somewhere, in museums and memory, the Concorde rests, a reminder of a time when humanity dared to fly faster than sound and reach for the stars. The skies had been conquered, space had been touched, and the long journey from Kitty Hawk to the Sea of Tranquility, from fragile wings of wood and cloth to rockets that could escape the Earth itself, stood as a testament to human courage, ingenuity, and the unquenchable desire to explore. The future would bring new challenges, new technologies, new dreams. But the foundations had been laid. And the story of flight, from the earliest days to the space race, would continue to inspire generations yet to come. Chapter 7: Jumbo Jets and Global Travel. Wide wings carried hundreds of passengers across oceans. The world became connected in ways once unimaginable. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, aviation stood at a crossroads. The space race had captured the world's imagination, and supersonic jets like the Concorde represented the glamorous cutting edge of technology. But for most people, air travel was still expensive, exclusive, and out of reach. Airlines were profitable, but they served primarily business travelers and the wealthy. The challenge facing the industry was how to make flying accessible to everyone, how to turn aviation from a luxury into a utility, as common as taking a train or a bus. The answer, as it turned out, was not to fly faster, but to fly bigger. Pan American World Airways, one of the most prestigious airlines of the era, approached Boeing in the mid-1960s with an audacious request. They wanted an aircraft that could carry twice as many passengers as anything currently flying. They envisioned a plane so large that it would fundamentally change the economics of air travel, lowering the cost per seat and making international flight affordable for ordinary families. Boeing took on the challenge. The result was the 747, an aircraft so large that people simply called it the jumbo jet. The Boeing 747 entered service in 1970, and it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was enormous. The fuselage was wide enough to seat 10 people across in economy class. It had 2 aisles running the length of the cabin. And most distinctively, it had a second level, a hump behind the cockpit that gave the aircraft its iconic profile. That upper deck originally housed a first-class lounge, a luxurious space where passengers could relax in comfortable seats, enjoying the novelty of being in a two-story airplane. The 747 could carry over 400 passengers, more than double the capacity of the jets that had come before. It had 4 powerful engines, enormous wings, and a range that allowed it to fly non-stop across the Pacific or the Atlantic with ease. It was a giant, and it was beautiful. When the first 747s entered service, they caused a sensation. Airports had to build new gates to accommodate them, with jet bridges tall enough to reach the upper deck. Runways had to be strengthened to handle the weight. Ground crews had to learn how to service an aircraft that dwarfed everything else on the ramp. But the gamble paid off. The 747 democratized long-haul travel. By carrying so many passengers on a single flight, airlines could offer tickets at prices that middle-class families could afford. Suddenly, a trip to Europe or Asia was no longer reserved for the elite. Teachers, students, retirees, and young backpackers filled the seats. The world opened up. Over the decades that followed, the 747 became the backbone of international aviation. It flew every major route, carried heads of state as Air Force One, transported cargo in its massive belly, and became a symbol of the jet age. Passengers loved it for its spaciousness and smooth ride. Pilots loved it for its stability and forgiving handling. It was, in many ways, the perfect airliner. The success of the 747 ushered in the era of wide-body aircraft. Other manufacturers quickly followed with their own designs. McDonnell Douglas introduced the DC-10, a 3-engine wide-body. Lockheed built the L-1011 TriStar, another 3-engine jet known for its advanced technology and quiet engines. Airbus, a European consortium formed to compete with American manufacturers, introduced the A300, a twin-engine wide-body that proved popular with airlines looking for efficiency on shorter routes. These wide-body aircraft increased passenger capacity dramatically. Airports became busier. Routes that had once required multiple connecting flights could now be flown non-stop. The hub-and-spoke model emerged, where airlines funneled passengers through major hubs like Atlanta, London, and Singapore, then sent them out on wide-body jets to destinations around the globe. Flying was no longer an adventure or a novelty. It was becoming routine, almost mundane. You booked a ticket, showed up at the airport, boarded a massive jet, and a few hours later you were on another continent. The magic hadn't entirely disappeared, but it had become familiar. As aircraft grew larger and more complex, the way they were controlled began to evolve as well. For decades, aircraft had been controlled through direct mechanical linkages. When a pilot moved the control yoke, cables and rods physically moved the control surfaces on the wings and tail. It was simple, reliable, and intuitive. The pilot could feel the aircraft responding, could sense the forces acting on the control surfaces. But as jets became faster and larger, this system became more difficult to manage. At high speeds, the forces on the control surfaces were enormous, requiring hydraulic systems to assist the pilot. And as aircraft grew more complex, with multiple redundant systems, engineers began to wonder if there might be a better way. The answer was fly-by-wire, a system where the pilot's control inputs were translated into electrical signals, processed by computers, and then sent to actuators that moved the control surfaces. There were no direct mechanical connections between the cockpit and the control surfaces. The computers acted as intermediaries, interpreting what the pilot wanted and adjusting the controls accordingly. Fly-by-wire had been used in military aircraft for years, particularly in highly maneuverable fighters that would be unstable without computer assistance. But bringing the technology to commercial aviation was a bold step. If the computers failed, the aircraft would be uncontrollable. Redundancy and reliability were paramount. Fly-by-wire controls appeared in commercial jets in the 1980s. Airbus was the pioneer, incorporating the technology into their designs early on. The Airbus A320, introduced in 1987, popularized digital flight control. It was a revolutionary aircraft, not because of its size or speed, but because of how it was flown. In the A320, the traditional control yoke was replaced with a small side stick, a joystick mounted on the side of the cockpit. The computers interpreted the pilot's inputs and adjusted the flight controls to keep the aircraft within safe parameters. The system included protections that prevented the pilot from overstressing the airframe, from stalling the aircraft, or from flying outside the designed flight envelope. It was, in effect, an aircraft that couldn't be crashed through pilot error, at least in theory. The A320 was controversial when it first appeared. Some pilots felt that the computers took too much control away from them, that they were becoming managers rather than aviators. Others embraced the technology, appreciating the reduced workload and the safety features. Over time, the advantages became clear. The A320 was efficient, reliable, and safe. It became one of the best-selling aircraft in history, and fly-by-wire became the standard for new designs. Boeing, initially more conservative, eventually adopted similar technology in their newer aircraft, though they retained the traditional control yoke rather than switching to a side stick. The debate over control philosophy continues to this day, but there's no question that computers have become integral to modern aviation. As aircraft technology advanced, so did the rules governing how they could be flown. For many years, aviation regulators had imposed strict limitations on twin-engine aircraft flying over oceans. The concern was simple: if one engine failed, the aircraft needed to be within a certain distance of an airport where it could land safely on the remaining engine. This meant that twin-engine jets were restricted to routes that stayed relatively close to land, while long ocean crossings were the domain of 3- and 4-engine aircraft like the 747 and DC-10. But engines were becoming more reliable. Failures were increasingly rare. And twin-engine aircraft were more efficient than their larger siblings, burning less fuel and costing less to maintain. Airlines wanted to use them on long-haul routes, but the regulations stood in the way. In the 1980s, regulators began to reconsider. They introduced ETOPS, which originally stood for Extended Range Twin-Engine Operational Performance Standards, though pilots jokingly called it engines turn or passengers swim. ETOPS rules allowed twin jets on long ocean routes, provided the aircraft and engines met stringent reliability standards and the airline had appropriate maintenance and operational procedures. The first aircraft to be granted ETOPS certification was the Boeing 767, a mid-sized twin-engine wide-body. It proved itself on transatlantic routes, flying reliably and efficiently. As confidence grew, ETOPS limits were extended further and further. Today, modern twin-engine jets like the Boeing 787 and Airbus A350 can fly routes that keep them over 6 hours away from the nearest airport, crossing the Pacific or flying over the poles with ease. ETOPS changed the landscape of long-haul aviation. Four-engine jets like the 747 and the A340 became less economical by comparison. Airlines shifted to twins, and the era of the jumbo jet began to wane. But efficiency wasn't just about the number of engines. It was also about weight. Every pound an aircraft carried into the air required fuel to lift and carry. Engineers had long sought materials that were lighter than aluminum but just as strong. The answer came in the form of composite materials, primarily carbon fiber reinforced polymers. These materials were lighter than aluminum, stronger in many applications, and resistant to corrosion and fatigue. They had been used in small quantities on aircraft for years, but in the 2000s, manufacturers began building entire fuselages and wings from composites. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, introduced in 2011, was the first major airliner to make extensive use of composites. About 50% of its structure, by weight, was composite material. This reduced the overall weight significantly, improving fuel efficiency and allowing the aircraft to fly farther on less fuel. The composite fuselage also allowed for higher cabin pressure and humidity, making the flight more comfortable for passengers. Airbus followed with the A350, another composite-heavy design. The use of these materials represented a fundamental shift in how aircraft were built, one that is likely to define the next generation of airliners. Inside the cockpit, change was just as dramatic. For decades, pilots had navigated using a bewildering array of analog gauges, dials, and needles. Altimeters, airspeed indicators, heading indicators, vertical speed indicators, engine instruments, navigation displays, each one a separate mechanical device. The cockpit of a 1970s airliner looked like the control room of a power plant, dense with information, demanding constant attention. But as computer technology advanced, it became possible to replace those mechanical instruments with screens. Glass cockpits, as they came to be known, replaced analog gauges with digital displays that could show multiple types of information in a clear, integrated format. A pilot could switch between different views with the press of a button, seeing navigation maps, engine data, or weather information on the same screen. The first glass cockpits appeared in military aircraft, but by the 1980s and 1990s, they were becoming standard in commercial jets. They reduced weight, simplified maintenance, and made information easier to read and interpret. They also allowed for better integration with autopilot and flight management systems, reducing pilot workload and improving safety. Navigation, too, was transformed by technology. For most of aviation history, pilots had navigated by following radio beacons, using instruments that pointed toward ground-based transmitters. It was effective, but limited. You could only navigate where there were beacons, and accuracy depended on distance and atmospheric conditions. The introduction of GPS, the Global Positioning System, changed everything. GPS used a constellation of satellites orbiting the Earth to provide precise position information anywhere on the planet. With GPS, a pilot could know their exact location to within a few meters, anywhere in the world, at any time. Routes could be flown more directly, saving time and fuel. Approaches to airports could be flown with precision even in poor weather. GPS improved navigation precision to a degree that would have seemed magical just a generation earlier. It became standard equipment on everything from small private planes to massive airliners. Combined with glass cockpits and fly-by-wire controls, modern aircraft were safer, more efficient, and easier to fly than ever before. But even as technology was making aircraft more efficient, there was still a desire, in some quarters, to go bigger. If the 747 had been revolutionary in its time, what would an aircraft that was even larger look like? Airbus decided to find out. In the late 1990s, they began developing the A380, an aircraft designed to be the largest passenger jet ever built. It was a double-decker throughout its entire length, with passenger cabins on both the main and upper decks. It could carry over 500 passengers in a typical configuration, and in an all-economy layout, it could theoretically seat over 800. The Airbus A380 first flew in 2005 and entered service in 2007. It was a marvel of engineering, a giant that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Watching it take off was surreal. Something that large should not be able to fly, and yet it lifted gracefully into the air, its four engines roaring, its massive wings flexing under the load. Airlines that operated the A380 used it on their busiest routes, flying between major hubs like London and Dubai, Singapore, and Sydney. Passengers marveled at the spaciousness, the quiet cabin, the smooth ride. Some configurations included bars, showers, and private suites. It was luxury on a scale that aviation had never seen. But the A380 arrived at a difficult time. Airlines were shifting away from the hub-and-spoke model that the A380 was designed for. Instead, they wanted smaller, more efficient aircraft that could fly point-to-point routes directly, bypassing the need for large hubs. The A380 was expensive to operate, and there were only a limited number of airports that could handle it. Orders were slow. Airbus continued to produce the A380 for over a decade, but in 2019, they announced that production would end. The last A380 was delivered in 2021. It had been a magnificent achievement, but it was, in many ways, a solution to a problem that no longer existed. The future belonged to smaller, more efficient twins like the 787 and A350. By the second decade of the 21st century, aviation had matured into a truly global industry. Billions of passengers flew every year. Aircraft connected every corner of the world. You could leave almost any major city and reach almost any other major city within 24 hours. The world had become connected in ways once unimaginable. Flying had gone from being a rare and dangerous adventure to being as routine as taking a taxi. The technology had advanced beyond what the pioneers of flight could have dreamed. Aircraft were controlled by computers, navigated by satellites, built from materials that didn't exist a generation ago. They were safer, quieter, more efficient, and more comfortable than ever before. And yet, the fundamental experience of flight remained. The moment of acceleration down the runway, the feeling of the wheels leaving the ground, the view from the window as the earth falls away and the sky opens up above. That sense of wonder, however familiar it might become, never entirely disappears. The jumbo jets that had opened the world to millions were aging now, being retired and replaced by newer, more efficient designs. The 747, once the queen of the skies, was fading from passenger service, though it continued to haul cargo across oceans. The A380, the largest of them all, was already becoming a rarity. But their legacy endured. They had made the world smaller, brought people together, and turned the dream of global travel into an everyday reality. And as aviation looked toward the future, toward electric propulsion, sustainable fuels, and perhaps even a return to supersonic flight, it did so standing on the shoulders of the giants that had come before. The long journey from Kitty Hawk to the jumbo jet, from fragile wings of wood and cloth to massive aircraft carrying hundreds across oceans, was a testament to human ingenuity, determination, and the endless desire to push beyond what is known, to explore, to connect, to fly. and that journey was far from over. Chapter 8: Space Shuttles and Reusable Dreams. The dream of routine spaceflight brought spacecraft that launched like rockets and landed like airplanes. Reuse became the next frontier. When the Apollo program ended in the early 1970s, humanity's relationship with space entered a strange, uncertain period. We had walked on the moon. We had proven that it was possible to leave the Earth and return. But the cost had been staggering, and the question lingered, what now? The Apollo spacecraft were magnificent machines, but they could only be used once. Each mission required a brand new rocket, a new command module, a new lunar lander. Everything was expendable, thrown away after a single use. NASA began to envision something different. What if spacecraft could be reused, like airplanes? What if astronauts could launch into space, complete their mission, and then glide back to Earth and land on a runway? The spacecraft could be refurbished, refueled, and flown again. It would make spaceflight routine, affordable, and sustainable. It was an ambitious vision, and it led to the development of the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle was unlike anything that had come before. It launched vertically, like a rocket, strapped to a massive external fuel tank and two solid rocket boosters. But it landed horizontally, like an airplane, gliding unpowered onto a runway. It had wings, a cargo bay large enough to carry satellites, and a crew cabin that could accommodate up to 7 astronauts. It was a hybrid, part spacecraft, part airplane, and it promised to be the future of spaceflight. On April 12, 1981, the Space Shuttle Columbia lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Commander John Young and pilot Robert Crippen sat in the cockpit, riding a pillar of flame into the sky. The solid rocket boosters roared, producing over 6 million pounds of thrust. The shuttle climbed steeply, accelerating toward orbit. 2 minutes after launch, the boosters burned out and separated, parachuting into the ocean to be recovered and reused. The main engines continued to burn, fed by the enormous external tank slung beneath the shuttle's belly. 8.5 minutes after launch, the main engines shut down. The external tank separated and tumbled back toward Earth, breaking apart as it re-entered the atmosphere. Columbia was in orbit. Young and Crippen spent 2 days in space, testing the shuttle systems, opening and closing the cargo bay doors, maneuvering with the thrusters. Everything worked as planned. When it was time to return, they fired the engines to slow down, dropping out of orbit and beginning the long fall back to Earth. Re-entry was the most dangerous part of the flight. The shuttle slammed into the atmosphere at over 17,000 miles per hour, friction heating the underside of the spacecraft to over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The belly was covered with thousands of heat-resistant tiles, each one carefully shaped and glued in place. If any of those tiles were damaged or missing, the heat could burn through the aluminum structure beneath, destroying the shuttle. But the tiles held. Columbia glowed like a meteor as it streaked across the sky, a trail of ionized gas following behind. Young guided the shuttle through the descent, the spacecraft acting more like a brick with wings than an airplane, falling fast and steep. At the last moment, he flared the nose, bleeding off speed, and Columbia touched down on the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The drag chute deployed, slowing the shuttle, and it rolled to a stop. The crowd erupted in cheers. The space shuttle had worked. It had launched, orbited, and landed safely. The era of reusable spaceflight had begun. Over the next few years, the shuttle fleet grew. Columbia was joined by Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis. Later, Endeavour was built as a replacement. The shuttles flew mission after mission, launching satellites, conducting experiments, proving that routine access to space was possible. But the shuttle was not as reusable as NASA had hoped. After each flight, the spacecraft required months of refurbishment. The heat-resistant tiles had to be inspected and replaced. The engines had to be overhauled. The solid rocket boosters had to be recovered from the ocean, disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled. The cost per flight remained high, far higher than the early optimistic projections. Still, the shuttle accomplished remarkable things. It launched satellites into orbit, repaired others already in space, and carried modules and equipment to build space stations. Astronauts became more diverse, with women, people of color, and international crew members flying regularly. Spaceflight was no longer the exclusive domain of military test pilots. But the shuttle's complexity also made it dangerous. Every flight was a high-stakes engineering challenge, with thousands of things that had to work perfectly. On January 28, 1986, the world learned just how dangerous it could be. That morning was unusually cold in Florida, with temperatures well below freezing. The Space Shuttle Challenger sat on the launch pad, fueled and ready, 7 astronauts aboard. Among them was Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher selected to be the first private citizen to fly in space. Millions of school children across America were watching live, excited to see a teacher go to space. Engineers had raised concerns about the cold weather. The solid rocket boosters used rubber O-rings to seal the joints between segments, and those O-rings were known to become stiff and less effective in cold temperatures. Some engineers recommended delaying the launch, but the decision was made to proceed. 73 seconds after liftoff, Challenger broke apart. One of the O-rings had failed, allowing hot gases to escape from the solid rocket booster. The flame burned through the attachment strut and into the external fuel tank. The tank ruptured, and the hydrogen and oxygen inside mixed and ignited. The shuttle was torn apart by aerodynamic forces, tumbling through the sky at twice the speed of sound. The crew cabin remained intact for a time, falling toward the ocean. Some of the astronauts may have survived the initial breakup, but there was no way to escape, no parachute system, no ejection seats. The cabin struck the water at over 200 miles per hour. No one survived. The nation was devastated. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years while investigators determined the cause and NASA implemented changes. The O-rings were redesigned. procedures were overhauled. But the fundamental lesson was sobering. Spaceflight was still dangerous, and overconfidence could be deadly. When the shuttles returned to flight, they continued their work, but the sense of routine had been shattered. Every launch was now understood to be a risk, every crew aware that they might not come home. The shuttles resumed their missions, and over the next decade and a half, they achieved things that no other spacecraft could. One of the most significant was the deployment of the Hubble Space Telescope in 1990. Hubble was a massive observatory designed to orbit above the Earth's atmosphere, where it could see the universe with unprecedented clarity, unblurred by air and weather. But shortly after deployment, engineers discovered a flaw. The main mirror had been ground to the wrong shape, a tiny error that made images blurry and useless. It was a disaster. Billions of dollars and years of work seemed wasted. But the shuttle made it possible to fix the problem. In 1993, a shuttle crew rendezvoused with Hubble, captured it with the robotic arm, and brought it into the cargo bay. Over the course of several spacewalks, astronauts installed corrective optics, essentially giving the telescope a pair of glasses. When they were done, Hubble was released back into orbit. The fix worked. Hubble began sending back images of astonishing beauty and scientific importance, deep views into distant galaxies, nebulae where stars were being born, the remnants of exploded stars, planets orbiting other suns. Hubble transformed our understanding of the universe, and it could not have been done without the shuttle. The shuttle also played a central role in building the International Space Station, the ISS, a project that represented unprecedented international cooperation. The ISS was a joint effort involving the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada. It was assembled in orbit, piece by piece, over more than a decade, with the shuttle delivering modules, solar arrays, and equipment. The station became a permanent human presence in space, continuously inhabited since the year 2000. It orbits about 250 miles above Earth, circling the planet every 90 minutes. Astronauts and cosmonauts live and work aboard for months at a time, conducting experiments in microgravity, studying the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body, and looking back at the Earth below. The ISS is a testament to what humanity can achieve when nations work together toward a common goal. It has hosted crews from dozens of countries. It has served as a laboratory, an observatory, and a symbol of peaceful cooperation in an often divided world. But even as the shuttle continued to fly, age and wear were taking their toll. By the early 2000s, the fleet was aging. Columbia, the first shuttle, had flown dozens of missions over more than 2 decades. On February 1, 2003, Columbia was returning from a 16-day mission in orbit. The crew of 7 was preparing for re-entry, looking forward to landing in Florida in less than an hour. But during launch, a piece of foam insulation had broken off from the external fuel tank and struck Columbia's left wing at high speed, punching a hole in the heat-resistant panels. No one realized the damage was serious. Engineers reviewed the footage but concluded the shuttle was safe to return. They were wrong. As Columbia re-entered the atmosphere, superheated air forced its way through the hole in the wing. The internal structure began to melt and fail. The wing broke apart. The shuttle tumbled out of control, disintegrating over Texas and Louisiana. All 7 crew members were killed. Once again, the nation mourned. Once again, the shuttle program was grounded. Investigators determined that the foam strike had caused the disaster and that NASA's safety culture had become complacent. Changes were made, inspections were improved, but the writing was on the wall. The shuttle was old, expensive, and dangerous. It was time to move on. The remaining shuttles, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour, flew a handful of final missions to complete the space station and service Hubble one last time. The final shuttle mission, STS-135, launched in July 2011. Atlantis carried supplies to the ISS, returned 2 weeks later, and landed at Kennedy Space Center. The era of the Space Shuttle was over. The shuttle had flown 135 missions over 30 years. It had carried over 350 astronauts into space. It had deployed satellites, built a space station, repaired Hubble, and conducted thousands of experiments. But it had also cost the lives of 14 astronauts, and it had never become the routine, affordable system that had been envisioned. Still, the dream of reusable spaceflight did not die with the shuttle. In fact, it was only just beginning to be realized, not by governments, but by private companies. Commercial spaceflight emerged in the 2000s, driven by entrepreneurs who believed that space should be accessible not just to governments, but to anyone with the resources and the will to reach it. Companies like SpaceX, founded by Elon Musk, and Blue Origin, founded by Jeff Bezos, began developing rockets and spacecraft with private funding. SpaceX, in particular, pursued the goal of full reusability with relentless focus. They developed the Falcon 9, a 2-stage rocket designed to launch satellites and cargo into orbit. But unlike traditional rockets, which were discarded after a single use, the Falcon 9's first stage was designed to return to Earth and land, either on a barge in the ocean or on a landing pad on land. The idea seemed far-fetched. Rockets had always been expendable. The forces involved in launch were so extreme, the speed so high, that reusing a rocket seemed impractical, if not impossible. But SpaceX kept trying. The early attempts were failures. The first stage would separate, flip around, fire its engines to slow down, and descend toward the landing site. But it would run out of fuel, or tip over, or crash into the ocean in a fiery explosion. Each failure was analyzed, lessons were learned, and the next attempt incorporated improvements. And then, in December 2015, it worked. A Falcon 9 first stage launched from Cape Canaveral, sent its payload toward orbit, separated, and then returned. It descended through the atmosphere, engines blazing, legs deployed, and touched down gently on a landing pad at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. The crowd watching erupted in cheers. It was a historic moment, the first time an orbital-class rocket booster had successfully returned and landed. Since that first success, the Falcon 9 routinely lands its first stage. Most launches now include a landing attempt, and the success rate is high. SpaceX has landed the same booster over a dozen times, refurbishing it and flying it again and again. The cost of launching payloads has dropped dramatically, making space more accessible than ever before. Other companies have followed. Blue Origin developed the New Shepard, a suborbital rocket designed to carry passengers on brief trips to the edge of space. It too lands vertically and is reused. Rocket Lab, a smaller company, has begun experimenting with reusability for their Electron rocket. The dream that NASA pursued with the Space Shuttle is finally being realized, not by a government agency bound by political and budgetary constraints, but by private companies driven by competition and innovation. Reusability has become the defining characteristic of the new space age. Rockets that once would have been discarded in the ocean are now landing, being refurbished, and flying again. The cost of access to space is dropping. Satellites are being launched by the thousands. Plans are being drawn for missions to the Moon, to Mars, and beyond. The Space Shuttle, for all its flaws, paved the way. It proved that spacecraft could launch like rockets and land like airplanes. It showed that humans could work in space for extended periods, that international cooperation was possible, and that the dream of routine spaceflight, while difficult, was not impossible. And now, as private companies build reusable rockets and governments plan for a return to the Moon and journeys to Mars, the next chapter of spaceflight is being written. The shuttle may be retired, its orbiters resting in museums, but its legacy endures. The dream of reaching the stars, of making space accessible, of pushing beyond the atmosphere and into the infinite, continues. The long journey from Kitty Hawk to the Space Shuttle to reusable rockets is a testament to human persistence. We have gone from fragile wings of wood and cloth to spacecraft that can carry tons of cargo into orbit and return to land on their tails. We have gone from the first tentative flights of a few seconds to missions that last months, to a space station that has been continuously inhabited for over 2 decades. The story of flight, from the beginning to now, is a story of dreamers and engineers, of risk and tragedy, of triumph and perseverance. It is a story that is far from over. And as we look to the future, to the Moon, to Mars, and beyond, we do so standing on the shoulders of everyone who dared to leave the ground, who dared to fly, who dared to reach for the stars. And the journey continues. Chapter 9. Modern Aviation and Emerging Technology. Composite materials, digital cockpits, and quiet engines define the present day. Aviation continues to evolve with steady precision. As the 21st century unfolded, aviation had become woven into the fabric of modern life. Millions of people flew every day, traveling for work, for family, for adventure. The skies were filled with aircraft, crisscrossing continents and oceans in endless patterns. What had once been miraculous was now routine. But beneath that routine, Beneath the familiar experience of boarding a plane and arriving hours later in a distant city, technology continued to advance, quietly but relentlessly. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the Airbus A350 represented the cutting edge of airliner design, aircraft built not just to be faster or larger, but to be more efficient, more comfortable, and more sustainable. These planes were different from their predecessors in fundamental ways, and the most visible difference was in what they were made of. For decades, airliners had been built primarily from aluminum, a metal prized for being lightweight and strong. But aluminum had limitations. It was subject to fatigue, developing microscopic cracks over time that could grow and weaken the structure. It corroded when exposed to moisture and salt. And while it was light compared to steel, it was still heavy compared to what engineers knew was possible. The answer was carbon fiber, a composite material made from strands of carbon woven into fabric and then embedded in a polymer resin. The result was a material that was lighter than aluminum, stronger in many applications, and resistant to corrosion and fatigue. It had been used in small amounts on aircraft for years, for fairings and interior panels. But building an entire fuselage or wing from composites was a monumental challenge. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, which entered service in 2011, was the first major airliner to use extensive carbon fiber. About 50% of the aircraft's structure by weight was composite, including the fuselage, wings, and tail. This reduced the overall weight significantly, allowing the aircraft to burn less fuel and fly farther. A lighter aircraft also meant less stress on the landing gear, less wear on the brakes, lower maintenance costs across the board. But the benefits went beyond weight. The composite fuselage allowed Boeing to pressurize the cabin to a lower altitude equivalent than aluminum aircraft could manage. In a traditional airliner cruising at 40,000 feet, the cabin pressure was equivalent to being at about 8,000 feet. In the 787, the cabin could be pressurized to the equivalent of 6,000 feet. The difference might seem small, but passengers felt it. There was less fatigue, less dizziness, fewer headaches. The air in the cabin could also be kept more humid, because composites don't corrode the way aluminum does. Passengers arrived at their destination feeling more refreshed. The 787 also featured larger windows than any other airliner, with electrochromic shading that allowed passengers to dim them electronically rather than pulling down a shade. The lighting inside the cabin could be adjusted to mimic sunrise or sunset, helping passengers adjust to new time zones. It was quieter, smoother, and more pleasant to fly. The Airbus A350, which followed a few years later, competed in the same class. It too made extensive use of composites, with a similar focus on efficiency, range, and passenger comfort. The competition between Boeing and Airbus drove innovation, each company pushing the other to build better, more advanced aircraft. These planes represented the state-of-the-art in aviation, the culmination of more than a century of learning, experimentation, and refinement. They were marvels of engineering, and yet they still burned jet fuel, still relied on turbine engines, still contributed to carbon emissions. The industry was acutely aware of this. Aviation accounted for a small but growing percentage of global emissions, and there was increasing pressure to find cleaner, more sustainable ways to fly. One solution being explored was sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. This was jet fuel produced not from petroleum, but from renewable sources like plant oils, agricultural waste, or even captured carbon dioxide. SAF could be used in existing engines without modification, and over its life cycle, from production to combustion, it reduced emissions significantly compared to conventional jet fuel. The challenge was scale. Producing SAF in large quantities was expensive, and the infrastructure to distribute it widely didn't yet exist. But airlines and fuel companies were investing in the technology, building refineries, and signing agreements to purchase SAF. It was a step toward making aviation more sustainable, a recognition that the industry could not continue indefinitely burning fossil fuels without consequence. Another possibility, still in its infancy, was electric aircraft. The idea seemed almost fantastical. Batteries were heavy, and energy density was low compared to jet fuel. A fully electric airliner capable of crossing oceans seemed impossibly far off. But for shorter flights, for regional routes and commuter travel, electric propulsion was beginning to look feasible. Electric aircraft prototypes were in testing around the world. Small planes, carrying a handful of passengers, powered by batteries and electric motors. They were quiet, remarkably so, with none of the roar of a turbine engine. They produced no emissions during flight. And as battery technology improved, driven largely by the electric vehicle industry, the range and capacity of electric aircraft were increasing. Several companies were working toward electric commuter planes that could carry 20 or 30 passengers on flights of a few hundred miles. These would be ideal for connecting smaller cities, for island hopping, for routes where the demand was modest but the need for connectivity was real. It was not a replacement for long-haul aviation, but it was a beginning, a glimpse of what might be possible in the coming decades. While engineers were rethinking how aircraft were powered, another revolution was happening in how they were flown, or more precisely, in who or what was flying them. Drones, or unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, had transformed from niche military tools into ubiquitous devices used by everyone from hobbyists to filmmakers to scientists. Drones transformed aerial photography and videography, making it possible to capture perspectives that once required helicopters or small planes. A filmmaker could now launch a small quadcopter from their backpack and shoot sweeping, cinematic shots for a fraction of the cost and complexity. But drones were far more than just flying cameras. They were being used for search and rescue, flying over disaster zones to locate survivors. They were inspecting bridges, power lines, and pipelines, accessing dangerous or hard-to-reach locations. They were delivering medical supplies to remote areas, transporting blood and vaccines across difficult terrain faster than any ground vehicle could manage. In agriculture, drones equipped with sensors were monitoring crops, identifying areas that needed water or fertilizer, improving yields and reducing waste. In conservation, they were tracking wildlife populations, mapping deforestation, and patrolling for poachers. UAVs now performed military and civilian missions that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. Military drones could loiter over a battlefield for hours or even days, providing real-time intelligence. Larger drones could carry weapons, conducting strikes in conflict zones without putting pilots at risk. The ethical and legal implications were complex and controversial, but the technology was undeniably effective. In the civilian world, regulatory frameworks were struggling to keep pace. How do you manage airspace when thousands of small drones are flying autonomously? How do you ensure safety, privacy, and security? These were questions that governments and aviation authorities were grappling with, trying to balance innovation with responsibility. The dream of autonomous flight was also extending to larger aircraft. Researchers were exploring the possibility of pilotless airliners, aircraft flown entirely by computers with no human in the cockpit. The technology was largely there. Modern aircraft were already heavily automated, capable of taking off, navigating, and landing with minimal human intervention. But the psychological and regulatory barriers were significant. Would passengers trust an aircraft with no pilot? Would regulators allow it? For now, the answer was no, but the question was being asked seriously. While drones and electric aircraft represented practical, near-term developments, other areas of research were pushing toward extremes, toward the very edges of what was possible. Hypersonic research continued worldwide, exploring flight at speeds greater than 5 times the speed of sound, Mach 5 and beyond. At those speeds, the physics of flight changed dramatically. The air compressed and heated so intensely that it became a plasma. Materials had to withstand temperatures that would melt most metals. Control surfaces had to operate in conditions that destroyed conventional designs. Military forces were interested in hypersonic weapons, missiles that could strike targets on the other side of the world in minutes, too fast for current defenses to intercept. But there were also ambitions for hypersonic passenger aircraft, planes that could fly from New York to Tokyo in 2 hours, making the Concorde look slow by comparison. The challenges were immense. Fuel consumption, heat management, sonic booms, cost. But research continued, in wind tunnels and test ranges, on supercomputers and in experimental vehicles. Whether hypersonic passenger flight would ever become practical was uncertain, but the pursuit of speed had always been part of aviation's story. Another dream, once the province of science fiction, was becoming reality: space tourism. For decades, spaceflight had been the exclusive domain of government astronauts and a handful of scientists. But in the 2020s, that began to change. Private companies, the same ones developing reusable rockets, turned their attention to carrying paying passengers. Space tourism flights now carried private citizens to the edge of space and beyond. Blue Origin's New Shepard took passengers on suborbital flights, ascending to over 60 miles altitude, crossing the boundary of space, providing a few minutes of weightlessness and a view of the Earth's curve against the black sky, before descending back to the desert. SpaceX went further, launching private citizens into orbit aboard their Crew Dragon spacecraft. These were not brief hops to the edge of space, but multi-day missions circling the Earth, experiencing sustained weightlessness, seeing sunrises and sunsets every 90 minutes. Virgin Galactic offered suborbital flights aboard a spaceplane launched from a carrier aircraft, providing a similar experience to Blue Origin's rocket but with the romance of wings and gliding. The cost was still astronomical, accessible only to the wealthy, but it was a start. The infrastructure was being built. The experience was being refined. And as with commercial aviation a century earlier, what began as a luxury for the few would eventually become accessible to more and more people. Perhaps the most astonishing development in recent aviation and aerospace history was not happening on Earth at all, but on Mars. In April 2021, a small helicopter named Ingenuity, carried to Mars aboard NASA's Perseverance rover, lifted off from the Martian surface and hovered for about 40 seconds before landing again. It was a brief flight, just 10 feet in altitude, but it was monumental. Mars helicopters had flown in another planet's atmosphere. The Martian atmosphere is incredibly thin, less than 1% as dense as Earth's, making flight extraordinarily difficult. The rotors had to spin much faster than they would on Earth, and every component had to be as light as possible. But it worked. Ingenuity went on to fly dozens of times, scouting ahead for the rover, exploring terrain, proving that powered flight was possible on another world. It was a direct descendant of the Wright Flyer, separated by more than a century and millions of miles, but linked by the same fundamental principles of lift, thrust, and control. Back on Earth, aviation had become safer than at any point in its history. Aviation accidents were far rarer than in early decades. Commercial aviation, in particular, had reached a level of safety that would have seemed impossible to the pioneers. The accident rate per million flights had dropped to a tiny fraction of what it had been in the mid-20th century. This was the result of countless incremental improvements. Better training for pilots, stricter maintenance protocols, redundant systems on aircraft, advanced weather forecasting, air traffic control technology that prevented collisions, a culture of safety that encouraged reporting problems without fear of punishment, so that issues could be identified and fixed before they caused accidents. When accidents did occur, they were investigated exhaustively. Every detail was examined, every failure analyzed, every lesson learned and implemented across the industry. Aviation learned from its mistakes in a way that few other industries did, and the result was that flying had become, statistically, the safest form of long-distance travel. This safety extended to all aspects of aviation. General aviation, small private planes, had become safer through better training and technology. Helicopters, once notoriously dangerous, had been made more reliable through engineering improvements and better understanding of their unique aerodynamics. Even military aviation, inherently risky, had seen accident rates decline as training improved and aircraft became more sophisticated. The modern era of aviation was characterized not by single dramatic breakthroughs, but by steady, incremental progress. Aircraft were a few percent more efficient each generation. Materials were a bit lighter, a bit stronger. Engines were a bit quieter, a bit cleaner. Safety improved year by year. It was not the stuff of headlines, but it was profoundly important. Aviation had matured from a wild, dangerous frontier into a reliable, essential infrastructure. It connected the world, enabled global commerce, brought families together, allowed people to see places their ancestors could never have imagined visiting. It did all this while becoming safer, more efficient, and more accessible. And yet, even in its maturity, aviation was not static. The technologies being developed today, electric propulsion, sustainable fuels, autonomous flight, represented the seeds of the next transformation. The industry was grappling with how to reduce its environmental impact, how to serve a growing global population, how to adapt to a changing climate and changing expectations. The story of flight had always been one of pushing boundaries, of dreamers and engineers refusing to accept limitations. From the Wright brothers' first tentative hops to airliners carrying hundreds across oceans, from the first astronauts to private citizens visiting space, from propellers to jets to rockets, the journey had been long and remarkable. And it was far from over. The aircraft of tomorrow would be quieter, cleaner, and perhaps unrecognizable compared to today's planes. They might be electric, hydrogen-powered, or use fuels we haven't yet invented. They might fly higher, faster, or more efficiently. They might be piloted by humans, or by sophisticated artificial intelligence, or some combination of both. What was certain was that humanity's relationship with the sky would continue to evolve. The urge to fly, to explore, to connect, to transcend the limits of geography and gravity was as strong as it had ever been. And as long as that urge remained, aviation would continue to advance, to surprise, and to inspire. The long journey from Kitty Hawk to Mars, from wood and fabric to carbon fiber and electric motors, from a few seconds in the air to permanent human presence in orbit, was a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and persistence. And somewhere, in a workshop or a laboratory, an engineer or a dreamer was already working on the next chapter, imagining what comes next, sketching designs, solving problems, building the future of flight. The story continues. The sky beckons, and humanity, as it has for more than a century, answers the call. Chapter 10. Human stories that shape the sky. Behind every machine stands a human story. Pilots, engineers, dreamers, and explorers carried aviation forward one bold step at a time. Throughout this long journey from the earliest days of flight to the modern era, it's easy to focus on the machines themselves, the aircraft and engines and technologies that made it all possible. But aviation has never really been about machines. It has always been about people. People with courage and curiosity, with stubbornness and vision, who refused to accept that the sky was beyond reach. In the beginning, when aviation was new and uncertain, pilots were navigating by the simplest means imaginable. There were no instruments to guide them, no radio beacons, no GPS satellites. Early pilots navigated using rivers and railroads, following the landscape below like a map spread out beneath them. They would trace the course of a river, watching it wind through valleys and plains, or follow the iron rails that connected towns and cities, trusting that the tracks would lead them where they needed to go. Flying in those days required an intimate knowledge of the land. Pilots memorized landmarks, water towers, church steeples, distinctive hills. They learned to read the terrain, to recognize where they were by the shape of a lake or the curve of a coastline. When clouds obscured their view or fog settled over the ground, they were flying blind, and many lost their way. Some ran out of fuel searching for their destination. Others became disoriented and crashed. Navigation was as much art as science, and the best pilots were those who could read the earth like a book. Cockpits once had no radios. Pilots flew in isolation, unable to communicate with the ground or with other aircraft. If weather turned dangerous or an engine faltered, there was no one to call for help, no one to relay information or provide guidance. They were alone in the sky, dependent entirely on their own skill and judgment. The introduction of radio changed everything. Pilots could now receive weather updates, report their position, call for assistance if something went wrong. Ground controllers could track aircraft, provide routing instructions, warn of hazards. Communication transformed aviation from a solitary endeavor into a coordinated system. But that transformation took time, and in the early years, many pilots resisted. They were independent, self-reliant, and some saw radios as unnecessary weight or as a crutch that would make pilots lazy and dependent. Still, the value became undeniable. Radio allowed for the development of air traffic control, systems that could coordinate the movements of multiple aircraft, ensuring they didn't collide in the air or on the runway. As air travel grew more popular and the skies became more crowded, air traffic control became essential. Today, air traffic control coordinates thousands of daily flights, a vast, invisible network of voices and radar screens, guiding aircraft safely from departure to destination. Controllers speak in clipped, precise language, using standardized phrases to avoid confusion. They watch their screens, tracking the progress of dozens of aircraft at once, maintaining separation, sequencing arrivals, managing departures. It is intense, demanding work that requires focus, quick thinking, and calm under pressure. A single mistake, a misheard instruction, or a moment of inattention can have catastrophic consequences. And yet, the system works remarkably well, day after day, handling millions of flights every year with extraordinary safety. Behind the coordination and technology, there were always the individuals. The controllers, sitting in darkened rooms filled with glowing screens, guiding unseen aircraft through the night. The mechanics, hands stained with grease, inspecting engines and tightening bolts, knowing that lives depended on their diligence. The engineers, hunched over blueprints and computer models, solving problems that had never been solved before. And, of course, the pilots. Pilots once wore goggles and scarves in open cockpits, exposed to the wind and weather. In those early days, flying was a cold, uncomfortable, often terrifying experience. There was no canopy to shield you from the elements, no heater to warm you at altitude. The wind tore at your face, stinging your eyes, numbing your hands. Pilots bundled up in leather jackets and thick gloves, wrapped scarves around their necks to keep out the chill. The goggles were essential, protecting their eyes from the wind and from insects that could strike like tiny bullets at speed. Flying in winter was brutal. Ice would form on the wings, on the struts, on the pilot's clothing. Your breath would fog in the frigid air. Your fingers would grow clumsy, making it hard to grip the controls. And yet they flew, because the mail had to get through, because there were records to break, because they could not imagine doing anything else. These pilots were a particular breed. Many were former military aviators, trained in war, accustomed to danger. Others were barnstormers, daredevils who had learned to fly by trial and error. They were often young, in their 20s or early 30s, and many did not live to see old age. The early years of aviation claimed a steady toll of lives. Pilots lost to crashes, to weather, to mechanical failures, to simple bad luck. But they kept flying. And gradually, things improved. Enclosed cockpits became standard. Instruments were developed that allowed pilots to fly without seeing the ground, using gyroscopes and altimeters to maintain orientation. Heating systems made winter flying bearable. Parachutes gave pilots a chance to survive if their aircraft failed. As aviation matured and passenger travel became more common, a new role emerged: the flight attendant. The first flight attendants were registered nurses, hired specifically because of their medical training. The airlines reasoned that passengers, nervous about flying in these new, unfamiliar machines, would be reassured by the presence of a trained nurse. If someone became ill or anxious, the nurse could provide care and comfort. The first flight attendant was a woman named Ellen Church, a nurse and a pilot herself, who convinced Boeing Air Transport to hire her and 7 other nurses in 1930. They wore uniforms, greeted passengers with calm professionalism, and attended to their needs during flight. They served meals, provided blankets, offered reassurance when turbulence shook the cabin. Over time, the role evolved. Medical training became less important as flying became safer and more routine. Flight attendants became hospitality professionals, focused on service and comfort. But their role in safety remained critical. In an emergency, they were trained to evacuate the aircraft, to administer first aid, to keep passengers calm in moments of crisis. They were, in many ways, the human face of aviation, the ones who made passengers feel welcome and cared for. Safety, always, was paramount. Every aspect of aviation was designed with safety in mind, every procedure refined through hard-won experience. When accidents occurred, investigators would arrive to piece together what had gone wrong. They would search for wreckage, examine twisted metal and burnt components, interview witnesses, analyze data. One of the most important tools in these investigations was the flight data recorder, colloquially known as the black box. Despite the name, aircraft black boxes are bright orange, painted in a vivid, fluorescent hue to make them easier to locate in wreckage. They record flight data, speed, altitude, heading, control inputs, engine performance, and they record the voices in the cockpit, preserving the final moments of a flight. These recordings have been invaluable in understanding accidents, identifying failures, and implementing changes to prevent similar tragedies. They have revealed human errors, mechanical failures, design flaws, and environmental factors. They have saved countless lives by allowing the industry to learn from its mistakes. Weather, throughout aviation's history, has been both an ally and an adversary. Clear skies and calm winds make flying a pleasure. But storms, fog, icing, and turbulence have always posed serious threats. Weather forecasting improved aviation safety dramatically over the decades. In the early days, pilots had little information about what conditions they would encounter. They would take off into uncertain skies, hoping for the best, trusting their instincts. As meteorology advanced, forecasts became more accurate. Pilots could plan routes around storms, delay departures until conditions improved, or divert to alternate airports if necessary. Weather reporting stations were established at airports around the world, providing real-time information on wind, visibility, and precipitation. One of the most significant developments was aviation weather radar, systems that could detect turbulence, thunderstorms, and other hazards ahead of the aircraft. Radar allowed pilots to see weather that was invisible to the eye, especially at night or in clouds. They could steer around dangerous cells, avoiding the worst of the turbulence and reducing the risk of structural damage or passenger injury. Modern aircraft are equipped with sophisticated weather radar, displaying colorful images on cockpit screens, with red indicating the most intense precipitation and turbulence, yellow and green showing lighter conditions. Pilots study these displays, adjusting their course to find the smoothest path, prioritizing passenger comfort and safety. But weather and aviation interact in other, less obvious ways. Jet contrails, those white streaks that aircraft leave across the sky, are formed when hot, humid exhaust from jet engines meets the cold air at high altitude. The water vapor condenses and freezes, forming thin clouds of ice crystals. These contrails can persist for hours, sometimes spreading to cover large areas of sky. Recent research has shown that jet contrails can affect climate. They trap heat radiating from the Earth's surface, contributing to warming, though the effect is localized and temporary compared to carbon dioxide emissions. Scientists are studying ways to minimize contrail formation, perhaps by adjusting flight altitudes or flight times, as part of broader efforts to reduce aviation's environmental impact. Throughout all of this, through every advance and setback, were the human stories, the individuals whose names we remember and the countless others whose contributions have been forgotten. The Wright brothers, who built bicycles and dreamed of wings. Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier with broken ribs. Neil Armstrong, who set foot on another world with just seconds of fuel remaining. Amelia Earhart, who vanished over the Pacific but inspired generations of women to pursue aviation. And then there were the names we don't remember. The mechanic who noticed a loose bolt and tightened it, preventing a catastrophe that never happened. The air traffic controller who spotted a potential conflict and averted a collision. The engineer who designed a redundant system that saved lives when the primary system failed. The flight attendant who kept passengers calm during an emergency landing. Every safe flight, every successful journey, is the result of thousands of people doing their jobs with care and competence. Aviation is a collective achievement, built on the work of millions, from the famous pioneers to the anonymous technicians working the night shift. And when you step back and look at the arc of this history, it is almost impossible to comprehend. In just 120 years, humans moved from bicycles to the moon. 120 years. There are people alive today who were born when propeller-driven biplanes were the height of technology and who have lived to see spacecraft land themselves after launching into orbit. The Wright Flyer flew 120 feet. A modern airliner can fly 12,000 miles without refueling. The first flights lasted seconds. The International Space Station has been continuously inhabited for over 2 decades. The first pilots navigated by following rivers. Today, autonomous drones deliver packages and explore other planets. The pace of change has been breathtaking, and it shows no signs of slowing. But throughout it all, the human element has remained constant. Aviation has always been about people, people with dreams and determination, with curiosity and courage. It has been about the willingness to take risks, to learn from failure, to push beyond what seems possible. The machines are remarkable, yes. The aircraft we fly today are marvels of engineering, the result of countless hours of design, testing, and refinement. But the machines are only tools. They are the means by which humans achieve their goals, reach their destinations, fulfill their dreams. Behind every flight is a pilot, trained and skilled, making decisions, managing systems, guiding the aircraft safely through the sky. Behind every flight is a team of people who prepared the aircraft, who planned the route, who monitored the weather, who ensured that everything was ready. And in every seat is a person, each with their own story. Someone traveling to see family, someone heading to a new job, someone exploring the world, someone returning home. Aviation connects these people, carries them across distances that would have been insurmountable just a few generations ago, and delivers them safely to their destinations. The sky, once so unreachable, is now a highway, a commons, a place where humanity moves with confidence and purpose. We have shaped the sky with our ambition and ingenuity, and the sky, in turn, has shaped us. It has expanded our horizons, challenged our limits, and reminded us of what we can achieve when we dare to dream. From the fields of Kitty Hawk to the surface of Mars, from the open cockpits of barnstormers to the glass cockpits of modern airliners, from the first tentative flights to the routine wonder of global travel, the story of aviation is a story of people. People who looked up and wondered. People who built and tested and flew. People who failed and tried again. People who refused to accept that the sky was beyond reach. And as we stand here, more than a century into the age of flight, surrounded by the hum of engines and the contrail stitching across the sky, we can look back at this journey with awe and gratitude. We can honor the pioneers who made it possible, the dreamers who imagined what could be, and the countless individuals who turned those dreams into reality. The journey from bicycles to the moon, from Earth to sky to space, is one of the great achievements of human civilization. And it is not finished. The future of flight is still being written, in research labs and design studios, on test ranges and in orbit. New technologies, new challenges, new dreams are emerging. But whatever comes next, it will be carried forward by people. People with courage and vision. People with skill and dedication. People who look at the sky and see not a limit, but an invitation. And as long as there are such people, as long as there are dreamers and builders and explorers, the story of flight will continue. The sky is vast, and there is still so much to discover. The journey continues, carried forward one bold step at a time, by the human stories that shape the sky and will continue to shape it for generations to come. And with that thought, we close this chapter of the story, grateful for the journey, inspired by the pioneers, and hopeful for what lies ahead. The sky beckons, as it always has. And humanity, as always, answers.